Ted Blake, Sally Calhoun, Michael Daly, Sally Kearns, Michael Landers, Gina McCusker, and Paul Pollock. In addition, we're joined by Town Manager Steve Bartha, Finance Director Rodney Conley, and Assistant Town Manager Jen Breaker. Also on the call is Selectman Chair Dan Bennett. This open meeting of the Finance Committee is being conducted remotely, consistent with Governor Baker's Executive Order of March 12, 2020. Due to the current state of emergency in the Commonwealth due to the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus. In order to mitigate the transmission of the COVID-19 virus, we have been advised and directed by the Commonwealth to suspend public gatherings, and as such, the Governor's order suspends the requirement of the open meeting law to have all meetings in a publicly accessible physical location. Further, all members of public bodies are allowed and encouraged to participate remotely. The order, which you can find posted with agenda materials for this meeting, allows public bodies to meet entirely remotely so long as reasonable public access is afforded so that the public can follow along with the deliberations of the meeting. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. This meeting will feature public comment. For this meeting, the Finance Committee is convened remotely via the WebEx app as posted on the town's website identifying how the public may join. Please note this meeting is being recorded and that some attendees are participating via video conference. Accordingly, please be aware that others may be able to see you, and take care not to screen share your computer. Anything you broadcast may be captured by the recording. All supporting materials that have been provided members of this body are available on the town website unless otherwise noted. The public is encouraged to follow along using the posted agenda unless otherwise noted. Before we turn to the first item on the agenda, I'd like to cover some ground rules for effective and clear conduct of the business and to ensure accurate meeting minutes are kept. As each item is addressed on the agenda and remarks are concluded, the chair will go down the line of members, inviting each by name to provide any comment, question, or motions. Please hold until your name is called. Please remember to mute your phone or computer when you're not speaking. Please remember to speak clearly and in a way that helps generate accurate minutes. And for any response, please wait until the chair yields the floor to you and state your name before speaking. If members wish to engage with other members, please do so with the chair, taking care to identify yourself. For items with public comment, we've established a phone number and email address for public comment. The phone number 978-777-0001 and press 2, or public comments at danversma.gov. This phone number and email address is also posted with the agenda and shown online with the streaming of this meeting. Finally, at the conclusion of any deliberations, the members of the committee will be unmuted for motions and voting of each budget. And lastly, just a comment that if anyone who was unable to join us last night wanted to view the overview of the budget that was discussed at the beginning of last night's meeting, you can certainly tune in via the DCAT website and I believe also on YouTube and see that meeting and catch the overview because we will be diving right into the general government budgets. And so with that, I will turn things over to Steve Bartha. Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, Mr. Bennett, welcome. It's my pleasure to pivot from the overview last night where we dove pretty deeply into revenues for next year and focus more tonight on the expenditure side of the proposed budget. As we discussed last night, the budget that is before this committee is significantly different from the budget that was put together in preparation of the March 14th hearing with the Board of Selectmen. At that time, we were preparing a proposed budget that had just more than $4 million in new spending to accomplish a number of key goals that were discussed in last night's meeting and driven by some very strong revenue growth that we had seen in recent years in some of our key non-property tax line items, including state aid and a number of local receipt categories. The expected gains there have been reversed. This is what we talked about last night. And so we'll focus tonight on how that proposed budget, which was just about a little bit under 4% increase, is now down to a 2.07% tax supported increase. On the spending side, it went from about a $4 million year-over-year budget increase to a $2.17 million increase. And as we discussed last night, Essex Tech, between Essex Tech and the actuarially required pension contribution, those two drivers account for almost exactly 50% of the proposed new spending for next year. So the net of those two categories, the year-over-year budget, and we have a $107 million operating budget, is up 1.03% from last year based on the changes that have been made over the last 8 to 10 weeks as we learned more about the crisis. So what I'd like to do, Mr. Chairman, with your permission, is provide sort of a broad overview of where those expenditure reductions came from. And then as we move through the operating budget, I can offer some general comment on each of the operating budgets. And then we would be happy to take questions as we go along, as we go from budget to budget. So as I noted, when the crisis started to unfold and it became evident that the closure of major portions of the economy were going to have a detrimental impact, not only on the lives of our residents, but also on some of the key revenue categories that support the operating budget. We had to cut a little bit less than $2 million out of the budget so that the revenues and expenditures tied out. Broadly speaking, as we discussed a little bit last night, $780,000 of those reductions come in the form of reversing the decision to implement the split payroll conversion this year. You know, that is an expense that will have to be accounted for at some point, but we have the support of the auditors to hold off on that. They understand that it's an important accounting move to make, but it's not one that needs to be made this year. We talked as well last night that we had managed to move $400,000 in OPEB contribution to our trust out of free cash into the tax levy. That's been reversed. As was noted last night by Keith Taverna and Dr. Dana, the school department cut a little north of $400,000 out of their operating budget. We've spent the past month and a half working with our union and non-union employees to generate a little bit north of $300,000 in COLA savings for next year. We've pulled $125,000 out of the benefits budget that was meant to shore up the deficiency that we've been looking at. So we're hopeful that with the plan design changes that we made this year, we won't be forced to make a budget transfer at next year's town meeting, but that is a possibility. And then the balance of the $1.92 million in reductions came from a variety of miscellaneous categories as we went through. So that is the big picture in terms of how the budget got from March 14th to May 21st. And I think as we normally do, we can start on page 12 of your budget books that you have, where we have our legislative departments. So the first four that we have are moderator, selectmen, finance committee, reserve, and legal counsel. And obviously based on the zeros on the right-hand column, there's very little change here outside of some corrections to several line items where we had been spending more than we had budgeted, and we were trying to solve those this year. So be happy to take any questions you may have.
Thanks, Steve. And why don't we take questions on all four of these at the same time? I think they'll be fairly straightforward. We'll begin with Sally Calhoun.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Steve, can you explain the increase in the selectmen budget for, what is it, for meals? Is it a meals item?
So yeah, this was a $100 increase based, as you can see, on the 19 actual. And I would point out in 17 and 18 we likely didn't spend zero, but we likely charged something off to another line item. So the increase in this year's budget of $100 is simply to bring that line item to where it had been, so that we weren't having to offset those costs elsewhere.
What kinds of things they charge to this account? What kinds of things does it cover?
So typically when we do our all-day budget workshop and we invite the public to come and spend the day with us, we may provide pastries and coffee for people who come to the public meetings. If a selectman were to go to an MMA event, that's the kind of expense that could either be charged off there or the dues and membership line down below.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna skip now to the management budget.
I think we're.
Okay, is that too far ahead? No, we're just in the first four. I'm sorry. Moderator, selectman, FinCom, legal counsel. I'm sorry. I miscounted. Thank you. That's the only question I had.
Mike Landers?
Good, thank you.
Ted Blake?
The elected positions for the selectmen, how does that break down? Is that every selectman gets a stipend?
I believe it's $3,000 per selectman and $3,500 to the chair.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted. Sally Kearns?
Thank you. I think it's a minor point. It's more just by way of explanation, but under the legal counsel account, I know that it's no difference 20 to 21. Well, what happened from 2019 when it was 72.3? Now it's 131.
So that's the actual versus the budgeted amount. The 121,000 is down, I want to say $40,000 or $50,000 from where it had been budgeted maybe 10 years ago until about 5 years ago. And quite frankly, we simply weren't using the $160,000 or $170,000 in that account. So we had dropped the budgeted number down to 120. So the FY20 budget is 120. Yeah.
Great. That's a good thing. Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Mike Daly?
I have no questions on the full budgets.
Thanks, Mike. Paul Pollock?
Yes, going back to the selectmen's budget. The dues and memberships, that's $1,000 increase. Now, in the previous year, 2000, I think it's 19, it was 6,782, then it dropped to 6,500, now it's going up 1,000. Is there an explanation for that?
I'm going to offer Rodney or Jen a chance to jump in. If they're not sure, then we will get back to you on that one.
So, yeah, through you, Mr. Chairman. So 6,782 was the 19 actual, and we budgeted 65 in 2020, which again will be short, so we'll have to supplement that from elsewhere. What essentially is that full bill is our membership to the MMA, and that's been increasing each year. So as opposed to a cannibalizing some of the other line items, we wanted to true it up to what the actual expense will be.
Okay, thank you. That's an adequate explanation.
Thank you.
I think I'm all set then with the remaining, with all the four items, budgets.
Thanks, Paul. Gina?
Just one question on the FinCom reserve. If we don't spend the 125,000, does that move to free cash at the end of the year?
That's correct.
Okay.
And we will be discussing a transfer from that account when we discuss the warrant next week. There's an expense line that we're going to want to cover at the special town meeting in June, because we have a line that won't make it to the end of the year. So we don't use it every year, but it's good to have because it gives the FinCom the ability to shift funds around before the year ends.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
Thanks, Gina. Just one question on the legal counsel. I noticed that there was a large increase between the actual in 2019 and the budgeted for last year, which is the same as this year. Just wondering if we are overestimating or how we've been doing in terms of that budget.
So it's a good question. Jen Breaker on the call actually staffs the cable committee for us, and she worked with the committee to go through the renewal, I believe, with Verizon. and we're going to be gearing up for our Comcast renewal. So that's an expense that ebbs and flows.
Great. That's all I have. So Jen, if you could unmute us, and we're going to take these one at a time, but I believe I've already got some motions set, so it'll just be quick votes. I have a motion from Sally Kearns to move the moderator's budget with a second from Michael Landers. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Great. I have a motion from Mike Landers, seconded by Sally Kearns, to move the selectmen's budget. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? I have a motion from Ted Blake, seconded by Sally Kearns, to move the Finance Committee Reserve Fund budget. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? I have a motion from Sally Kearns, seconded by Mike Landers, to move the Legal Counsel budget. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Great, thank you.
Okay, moving on to the management budget, which is on page 13. And I'm going to apologize, given the upside down year that we've had. Normally at this point in the process, you would have the benefit of having the budget narratives alongside the line items, and that often helps to clarify some of the questions. But given that we've been operating remotely and are not yet bringing staff back into our public buildings, we were focused on getting the numbers to tie out, and the words will come later. But I understand that deprives you of some of the context that you normally have for the budget. I'll point out a couple of things in the management budget. The two full-time employees who are budgeted in this budget are part of the group that won't be taking a COLA on July 1st. But the increase of 2.6% in the salary line is related to the compensation and classification study that we did last fiscal year, where we had a consultant look at all of our non-union employees from management down to our confidential administrative positions. And these adjustments came out of that study. The increase in consulting services, we launched our Citizens Academy last year, and this increase is to support the second phase of that. Candidly, we haven't quite figured out what impact COVID is going to have on that, but we did graduate 20 citizens last fall before the selectmen, who went through essentially their semester boot camp learning about the town of Danvers. So we wanted to make sure that we had funding to support that program. And then there's an increase in the general office supplies to, as has been noted before and will likely be noted again, as we're looking at our most recent year of actuals and we see areas where we've overspent, we try to correct that from budget to budget.
Gina, any questions?
Just, how much does Citizens Academy cost us? And if we're running short of funds, is that something you'd consider postponing to the following year?
I'm going to invite Jen to come on. She created that program and ran it last year, so she'll have a better handle on the cost. And again, we haven't really discussed the fall, but she may want to. Maybe I can learn something too on the call tonight. We've been a little bit distracted, but I'll learn with you guys.
I thank you all. Citizens Academy cost us under $5,000 to run in the first year. We did have some upfront costs in the first year that we don't anticipate having in year two. However, if year two looks different and maybe is conducted remotely, we could have some costs that we were not anticipating. Most of the costs are minimal supplies. We do provide food for the cadets and some small graduation tokens.
Okay, not significant. Okay, thank you.
Paul Pollock?
Sorry, 1 second, Paul. I'm still trying to figure out where everybody is on the screen tonight. Paul, you're all set.
Three things. Printing, general office supplies, printing and general office supplies. And I don't really object to any of it. I just wondered why we have to increase it. Is it something that you fear overall costs will go up, or is this something that is impossible to level fund at this time and under the conditions of what we're facing down the road? And I understand it's not gonna, hopefully not gonna break the bank. They're not large sums of money. When you go through the whole budget item by item, you keep looking at things that are going up. I know even gas and oil seems to be going up.
No, gas is going in the right direction this year.
Oh, it is, okay, well,
Oil-
maybe I misread it, but oil. But anyway, it just struck me as, they're going up, Steve, and I wonder why, at some point, for instance, consulting services, they're 18,692 in 2019, 15,000, and now we're going to 1750. Now, I'm not opposed to consulting services because we have to have them, but is there any point in the discussion throughout the evening and with this budget that items cannot, a lot of them are level funded, I understand that, and then there's just some that just keep popping up.
Yep. I can address all three of those questions. So in terms of the printing costs and there are a number of line items in this budget that if you look back to 17 and 18, they show a zero. And that's because up until FY19, the management budget and the IT budget were merged as MIS. And as our IT budget became a distinct department, we separated out those costs 2 years ago. So part of the increase is simply figuring out what the right amount is in each budget, because they had been in one budget, and we're making a point now of tracking those expenses much more closely by service area. Part of the increase is also, we've made an effort, and I think the annual report in the last couple of years reflects that we've tried to increase the quality of the product and the quality of the document that we're producing, so that the old annual report was bound in plastic and black and white, and we're producing a color annual report now with a lot more staff effort that goes into it to try to create something that we hope is used throughout the year. So part of that is not necessarily the cost of paper going up; it's intentional that we're trying to up our game a little bit in terms of what we're producing. The consulting services line, that's one that in recent years has been used for things like the comp and class study that we did. We earned a community compact grant from the state to do that study. The cost of the study was more than the grant, so we were able to lean on the consulting services line in the management budget to hire the consultant to do that work. We paid for our community survey out of this line a couple years ago. So it's a line certainly that in a bad year probably won't get touched, but it's there so that as opportunities present themselves to do things like that, we're able to respond.
Thank you. I'm all set, CR.
Thanks, Paul. Michael Daly.
I have no questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Sally Kearns.
In most of these budgets, as others have, zeroed in on the supplies, photocopy supplies, consulting services, and the point has been made, but I'm going to say it again, that this is a year that this is extraordinary. So in a normal year, would I be looking at, 1,500 here, 2,500 there? No, not necessarily, but this is extraordinary. And so I think it really does behoove us, even if the gestures are somewhat symbolic. Do we really need to have an increase in photocopy supplies from 33 to 4,500? Something like, the Citizens Academy, that's a nice idea. It was a nice program for the people who did it. I know, I was there at the meeting when they gave out their certificates, fine. But maybe right now, maybe that's something that we put on hold or pause. I'm not saying get rid of it, but I just think we have to acknowledge the extraordinary circumstances that we find ourselves in. And it's not, it's not that we don't support quality programming or a nice annual report. But frankly, black and white's fine for now, in my view. You know, I just think, you know, these revenue projections are a bit optimistic. We'll be back here again having to do maybe more of this. I just think what you can do now is helpful. And, you know, I think 1,500 here and 1,500 there, and pretty soon you're talking serious money. There we have it.
Thank you, Sally. Do you have any other questions before we move on?
Good.
No? Great. Ted Blake?
I don't think I have any questions here. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike Landers?
I'm good. Thank you.
And
lastly, Sally Calhoun?
Thank you. And kind of along the same lines as Clarence was raising, you know, for the out-of-state travel expenses, the fiscal 18 and 19 actual were 6,200 and 11,000 respectively, and yet our budget proposal is for 20,000, and it just seems again it's kind of one of those items that we'll probably have some control over in the coming fiscal year and probably hold back on. It's one of those items in the budget that I think kind of should be highlighted as areas that could be reduced, either before we present it to town meeting or certainly as something is one of the items on the list of possible cuts if we need to as we move forward into the fall. I don't know what the best way is to do that. Is it do anticipatory cuts, or do we kind of wait to see what comes? What do you think, Steve?
I can speak generally to that. I think, well, I'll talk about that specific line first, and then I'll offer sort of a general comment. This is the line where any of the department heads, when they're pursuing conferences or training, it goes through my office and gets approved here before it's allocated. So this is for a number of different departments. It has always been budgeted here. It's actually down. It had been budgeted for many years at 25,000. We dropped it a couple of years ago to 20. And I guess what I would say generally, I understand completely what Sally and Sally are saying. If when we zoom out to kind of 30,000 feet, if the budget, we've reduced the budget, close to half of the proposed spending is gone from a month ago. So we've pulled out some pretty significant drivers, in part because we agree 100% that the revenue picture is not good. If in the fall things can remain dangerous for us on the revenue front, we're going to have much bigger decisions to make than office supplies or out-of-state travel. And I guess you posed the question about making cuts proactively or reactively. What I would offer is that $2 million has been removed from the budget in anticipation of what we're in and what's coming. And I think we can talk about. We did talk last night a little bit about some of the levers that we have to pull if things remain on a flat or downward trajectory months from now. So.
And I guess I'm sure everybody feels this way, but just to say it out loud, I would much rather see careful combing through and culling of items like these in each budget before we start talking about any kind of reduction in employees or reduction in services. And that goes without saying. I know, but as a member of the finance committee, I just feel I just need to say it out loud.
Well, if I can give you some comfort or peace of mind, that is absolutely the approach that would be taken. When the first thing that happens when you're approaching the end of a budget year and you're tight, the first thing you do is put a spending freeze on. So operating budgets are frozen. You're not buying, you're not replacing, you're not restocking, things like that. So the types of line items we're talking about now, I don't believe that a lot of conferences are going to happen next year. I think ours, I suspect Jen and I will not be traveling to an ICMA conference this year, though there will be a remote offering of some sort. we can cut that budget now and offset it with a revenue reduction, or we can simply not take the trip. And then two things happen. The funds flow at the end of the year into free cash. And I think importantly, at least from my, philosophically from my perspective, professional development and employee training is important. And if we make those reductions now, it's awfully hard to put them back 2-3 years from now. So it may not, I know that it may not be I hope that it's a satisfactory answer, but I understand that it's, your point is very well taken. And I think we could, if the will of this board is to make some adjustments, we certainly can do that. But I do feel we've positioned this budget to be able to respond to whatever comes next.
Thanks. One other question, Stephen. It's just that I just don't remember. If within one budget, say management budget, you are free to move money around within this department, but if you found that there was a shortfall, you'd have to go before town meeting and FinCom first to authorize moving from one department budget to another, right? Am I remembering that correctly?
The Finance Committee is authorized to move the Finance Committee reserve, and that's it. And everything else requires, as we do at town meeting each year, budget transfers.
But within the management budget, for instance, that's you found there was some need for some particular increased cost, and this is probably not a good example because this budget is pretty stable. But in another one, let's say the police department budget or something, they could move stuff within their bottom line.
So no, not from salaries to operating. And Rodney can jump on and correct me if I misstate that. The way that we vote our budgets, I believe that the transfers, even within a department, if they're going from salary to operating, require approval. Is that correct, Rodney, or do I have that wrong?
That's correct. So any of the line items within the operating budget can kind of go back and forth, but personnel is one section, operating is another.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Those are my only questions.
Thank you, Sally. Steve, I wasn't sure where we were going to ask this question. We have a question from a citizen, if I can get into my phone. But you were mentioning revenue predictions, so it's certainly not an inappropriate time. This comes from town meeting member Bill Bates asking, how are you predicting an increase of $261,000 in the pilots program?
Hello, Bill. So we did address that last night. That line is seeing an increase for two reasons. One, it's the first full year of our host agreement. No, I'm getting a shake from Ronnie. That may be entirely the adjustment to the pilot payment that Electric has made to the town. So the current formula was set in 1995, and the light board is phasing in a new pilot over a new formula over the next 4 fiscal years. Thank you, Ronnie. Miscellaneous receipts, is that marijuana?
Fees, I believe, is the host agreement.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
All right. If Jen could unmute us. And if I could get a motion.
CR.
Yes. Oh.
Before we vote, I want to make clear, I'm going to vote for these budgets, but I really thank Sally Calhoun and Sally Kearns for bringing this up because it's been bothering me too. And I think Steve's answered it well, but I'm just very queasy about where we're going to be in October or November or December. And if you look at that management budget, I know you can't do this, but the salaries and wages increases is basically about the same as the total operating expenses. But we can't take that money. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay. I hope we're not getting into a point where we're looking at each other about 5 or 6 months, and now we're going to be making cuts in actual personnel. And this is what I'm very fearful of. The last time we went through this, in I think it was 2009 or 10, we had to cut a couple of policemen, I believe. We had a couple of fire. And if there's any way to save money up front and to avoid that, I'd like to find any way we can do that. And apparently it isn't moving from operational to salaries and wages. Is that correct, Steve? That's basically what Rodney just said. So any money we save, let's say in the management budget here right now, we can move it around in the management budget if we don't spend it, or it goes to free cash, correct?
Or it can be appropriated to elsewhere by the finance committee at a special town meeting.
All right, but we would have to go through the whole, would it have to go to selectmen first and then the finance committee?
So, yeah, if we did a special town meeting, we would have to start, we would schedule the town meeting, prepare the warrant, start with the selectmen to the finance
Right.
committee, and then to the town meeting. And just to be clear, we're planning to do a fall town meeting for zoning this year. So we have one on the calendar. We haven't set a date yet, but likely October, November, we're going to be having a special town meeting. And I just want to offer, I would go so far as to say we're probably more concerned than you are about this budget and where we're going to be in 4 or 5 months. But for some context, we have, if you look across all of the operating budgets in the general fund, we budget about $38,000 for professional development each year. That's less than 0.3% of the total budget.
Mm-hmm.
So if we were to zero that out now in anticipation of the economy worsening, anything we'd be facing in the fall would be magnitudes of that.
Right.
And I guess that was my point, is making small changes now in anticipation of things getting worse makes perfect sense. But if we're facing, if things turn out worse than we expect, we're going to have big decisions to make. And one of the notes, just in terms of how the budget, the budget gets approved, the funding becomes available on July 1st, but some of these accounts are spent 1/12 at a time. Some aren't spent till the end of the year. Capital is a good example where there's about $720,000 in proposed capital for this year from free cash. But many of those purchases don't happen until the spring anyway. And you can bet this is a year where a lot of those purchases aren't going to be made out of the gate, because even if the money's appropriated, there's going to be a lot of caution in determining where we are and how we move forward.
Yeah, that explanation does set well with me, to be honest with you, because then you do have your fallback, I guess, is probably what the words I'm going to use. So okay, that's fine. I'll move on. Thank you, CR.
No problem. Paul, while you're still unmuted, do you want to move the budget?
Management budget.
Great, thank you. And a second by Sally Kearns, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Great.
The information technology budget, without the narrative, I'll jump right to the line that I'm sure everyone has the same question on, and that is the permanent full-time line. So the IT department, just quick history, when I started in 2015, we did an IT study, and it sort of showed what we already knew, which was with a town as complex as ours in terms of having an electric department and a robust GIS, online permitting, a data center, a 911 center, we were due for an IT director. So we created Colby's position years ago. Since then, we've been taking on regional partners. So we do some hosting for Essex. We're supporting the library in ways we haven't before. We've spent the past 1.5 years working with the school department. And the increase here, the position here, is it's the one new position that was proposed as part of this budget. At this point, there's no plan on filling the position, but I'd like to speak to the funding source for a moment, and that is with the creation of our network engineer, which is a position, we took an old position, somebody left the organization, we redesigned the position. This network engineer has been able to take on some of the back end work at the schools, and the funding for this position, which is in the budget, which would be an administrative support position to coordinate help desk, purchasing contracts, vendor relations, and the sort, and bill paying, is fully offset by the elimination of several contracts on the school side. So it's a position that does not exist yet, isn't going to be filled as far as I'm concerned, until we're through whatever this is. But this is one that when we talked the other night about vacant funded positions, this is one that would remain frozen. But I just wanted to make that point. This is offset by reductions that were made in the school department over the winter as we were preparing for the budget process. And then the other increase that I would point out, the telephone, that's not necessarily an increase. We've been moving, Colby and his team have been taking on phones organization-wide. So we've been consolidating a lot of the bills to one department. So we're trying to get our phone expenses all under one department, which is part of the reason that that's going up, as well as some some hardware switching out. So those are really kind of the two big pieces in the IT budget.
Thanks, Steve. Sally Calhoun?
I don't have any questions. Thanks, Steve. You anticipated one.
Mike Landers?
So, Steve, we're not going to fill this position now. We're just in anticipation on a wait and see.
It's an identified need. Oh, sorry, you got muted again, Mike.
That's right. Go ahead.
Was that the end of the question?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, that's correct.
So I don't believe it was that short.
I think there's an identified need for the amount of work that the IT department is doing now in support of the library and the schools and some regional partners. We need somebody to be managing that office the way that all of the other offices are managed, so that our IT director and network engineer aren't being pulled. They're already being pulled in 25 directions, but this prevents them from, working on payroll and invoicing and contract management and bids and things like that, so they can focus on IT. And again, the reason it's still in this budget is because as we were preparing this early this year, we were able to eliminate an equal amount of contracted service. So the schools no longer have to contract for some of their network support, because we've been able to take that on in-house, and that freed up the resources to address this organizational need. But to the point, given where we are, this is not a position that would be advertised anytime soon. And just for some context, I just want to point, we currently, snapshot in time, so in March, we have close to $650,000 in positions currently that are budgeted and are vacant due to either retirements or folks taking other jobs. So that's essentially frozen. We're not going to be able to keep those frozen. Some of those are police and firefighters, for example. But all of those, I guess this is an indirect way of responding again to Paul and Sally's comment. If it gets worse in the fall, we'll still have several $100,000 in vacant positions that, as a step one, could be deappropriated, because then you're not impacting a current employee, you're impacting a funded but vacant position, which is much different.
That makes sense. I guess to get to that point, this is the unfortunate truth, and I guess the elephant in the room, and that is that in some respects, I think we can understand that the budget is a placeholder, and we really don't know where we're going. I think that both the school department and general government has done a fantastic job in trying to put together materials and budget that is in our best interest, and also in our best belief, something we can go forward with. But if this gets bad, worse than it is, and there's every possibility that it will, I don't think we can completely understand. I think to go back to 2008 makes some sense, but frankly, we're already past that in terms of the losses that we have in jobs. We're already headed down a road that's far worse than we saw in 2008, and probably far worse than we've seen that anyone in our lifetime has seen. We can't prepare for that necessarily we're going to have to deal with it if it gets there. We can hope that it doesn't. But I agree with the town manager. I'm just not sure that even as nice as it might feel to cut some $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 from this budget, it's not going to help any if we get to that point. And the cuts are going to be deep and they're going to hurt. And let's hope that that doesn't happen and that we don't have to make those cuts. But I think that we've shown a willingness to be somewhat proactive, but I just don't know what we're going to face over the course of the next 18 months, and I don't think anybody does. And again, if it gets bad, $30,000 isn't going to make a difference. So it makes sense to me to keep those things there, hope for the best, and if we do come out of this and we don't face the real trouble that we might think we could, then we're great and we move forward into 2021 ready to go. But if not, it's going to be something that none of us have ever faced before. With that, since that nice happy news for everyone.
Thanks, Mike.
I don't think I have anything further to add.
Okay, great. Sally Kearns?
No, I'm okay. Thank you.
Michael Daly?
How about 53019 training services?
I think Colby's actually still on the call. Do you want to speak to that, Colby, if you're still there?
Sure. I don't have the budget in front of me. Was there an increase in that line item?
Going from 10,250 to 12,000. Rodney's raising his hand as well.
If I can jump in, I believe that might be related to website training, Colby.
Well, I know we consolidated some line items as well, so you can see some line items collapsed and moved into other lines.
So I think your sound's not great, Colby. I think, Mike, if you look up a couple of lines, computer maintenance is down 2,500 and the consulting services is zeroed out. So sometimes what happens in these operating budgets is if we're finding that costs are more appropriately charged to one line versus another, we may try to offset them and shift them into the right line items. And I believe that's what Colby was saying, is that without the budget in front of him, that seems to be what's going on here. There are a couple of lines that are going down and they seem to be offset by the ones that are going up.
All right. And while we're here, are we going to expect another technology article from the school department?
We'll cover that next week as part of the warrant review.
Well, the answer is probably yes. It's going to be a yearly request from the school department.
Yep.
All right. Thank you. That's it.
Thanks, Mike. Paul Pollock?
I'm all set.
Thanks, Paul. Gina?
No questions, thanks.
Great, thank you. Jen, if you could unmute us all. And we have a motion from Mike Landers with a second from Ted Blake to move the IT budget. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Great, thank you. Steve?
Turning to page 15, department heads budget. This budget is down significantly from last year for two reasons. And you'll want to dog ear this page because when we get to the HR budget, we'll want to refer back to this budget. But our HR director moved on in late fiscal year 2019. And at that point, we reorganized that department. So we downgraded the HR director position into an HR generalist, and we upgraded an administrative assistant to an HR assistant. And the assistant town manager took on the department head level oversight of the functional area. So what's out of the department head budget is the fact that we're no longer funding an HR director position. So Jen received a bump last year to take on that high level duty. There's a considerable increase in the HR budget, which mostly washes with what's here. And then the other reason this is down is that this is one of the departments where the COLA is zeroed out as part of the hours change that we talked about last night. And then the other shift that stood out, and we discussed with the selectmen, the education incentive, that is the Quinn bill for the police chief, and that was shifted into the base because it was really, this is kind of wonky accounting, but it was always tracked separately. The COLA always applied to it. It's pension eligible, so there's really no difference where it's budgeted, and so it simplifies the life of the accounting department to have it part of there. So you'll see it zeroed out this year in the budget, and it's been converted into salary. But again, there's no impact there because the base it was always adjusted along with the base. So that's why this budget is down. There's one position less being funded here, no COLA adjustments, and when we get to HR, we can talk about the positions that are there.
Thank you. Gina McCusker?
So I just looked at the HR budget. The salaries are up 69,000, and these salaries are down 114. That makes sense.
So there's some, yeah, when we get to HR, we can talk. There was actually a change in the number of hours one of those employees worked, but that'll
Okay.
Yeah, but we can get into some of the detail on those.
Okay, no other questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Gina. Paul?
I'm all set, CR. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Daly?
No questions.
Sally Kearns?
I'm just sort of curious whether the consolidation and reconfiguration of those three positions, did you set out to do it that way, or did it happen to work out this way and you're pleased that you were able to do it?
Both. I think we after Steve Delaney's retirement, we brought in an HR director from the private sector who lasted about a year. And then someone moved from another municipality, and that didn't work out. And at that point, Jen had been brought on as the assistant town manager. She had that background from her prior municipality. So we've been able to hire two young rising professionals to work in the HR department in the role of assistant and generalist, and along with our benefits coordinator who has been with us for years. And so now we have it's really just same number of people overseeing the function, but different roles and duties, and it's working out very well.
Good. Okay. Thanks.
Sally. Ted?
I don't think I have anything. Thanks.
Mike Landers?
Educational incentive. It's good to see that Pat obviously has a doctorate plus that amount, but other than that, no questions.
Thank you. And Sally Calhoun?
Thank you. So, Steve, are you saying that the agreement to forego COLA is going to be reflected across all the departments?
It is not all I mean, as we talked about last night, the negotiated COLAs range from 0 to 1.5%, depending on the bargaining unit and the job. But those changes are reflected in this budget. That's part of the way we got the budget from where it was to where it is.
Thank you. I have no other question.
Great, thank you. If Jen could unmute us. And I have a motion from Ted Blake, seconded by Michael Landers, to move the department head budget. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Great, thank you. Steve?
Moving on to the accounting department, in keeping with the sort of the high-level overviews that I've been providing, the change in salaries there is related to the hiring of a new employee. Our assistant town accountant departed last year for a new job. Our current town accountant made a request to slide into the assistant accountant role, and our new town accountant actually started in the midst of this health crisis that we're in. So she's been working very hard to learn the people and the systems and the accounts behind the scenes, but she is eager to join us in person. But this adjustment is the way that the salaries worked out when we brought the department back to full staffing. And then down below, the consulting and auditing services, as has been mentioned before, one is up, one is down. They're budget neutral, but we're assigning the costs where they belong.
Thanks, Steve. Sally Calhoun?
I have no questions, thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Mike Landers?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Thank you. Ted Blake?
All set.
Sally Kearns?
All good, thank you.
Mike Daly?
Also,
Paul Pollock?
No questions.
And Gina McCusker?
Is the consulting and auditing just a split from the prior year?
Rodney, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so we had a similar amount budgeted in FY20, but the expense is really a consulting expense. So this budget, we decided to properly show the consulting line versus just lumping it in with the auditing line like we did in FY20.
Okay, thanks.
Welcome.
Great. Jen, if you could unmute us, please. And I have a motion from Gina McCusker, seconded by Sally Kearns, to move the accounting budget. All in favor? Opposed? Thank you. Steve?
Thank you. Moving on to the assessing department. Again, the adjustments in this department are a combination of the COLAs that were negotiated and part of the compensation and classification study being implemented. When this budget was being developed, or as we were reviewing the budget, we accused the chief assessor of knowing that this crisis was coming and doing his project last year so that he could eliminate that one-time expense this year and try to look like the most responsible among us. But the $68,000 decrease there, without the narrative in front of you, I'll remind everybody, we did a data quality control project in the assessing department last year. This is something that hadn't been done in many, many years, and we brought in an outside consultant to help us go through all of the valuation factors and thresholds to ensure that internally there was equity across the categories. And so that's an expense we would expect to see maybe once every 10 years. So that $68,000 decrease is because the work was done this year and isn't necessary next year. The decrease in the tuition reimbursement reflects the fact that the chief assessor, in addition to he's been taking on additional duties in support of the finance director, is also completing his master's degree in public administration this year. So the decrease there is related to that. So overall, the budget is down significantly. But if you were to compare the 21 proposed to the 19 actual, you'll see that fiscal year 20 was in many ways an outlier for that department.
Thanks, Steve. Gina?
No questions, thanks.
Thanks. Paul?
I'm all set.
Mike Daly?
no questions.
Sally Kearns?
Sorry, one more time, Steve. It's down because, why? You moved, it's largely an accounting thing, right?
No, for the consulting services, if you look at the 17, 18, 19 actuals, it was right around 60,000. That number was bumped up to $108,000 last year. I believe most of that was offset by a contribution from the overlay reserve, so it wasn't actually a tax-supported expense, but it showed up in the operating, and that was to take on a one-time project to essentially do a data quality control of our back-end revaluation data. So we're not doing that again. That's a one-time expense. So we're dropping it down to $40,000 this year.
Okay. Thank you.
Sally, Ted?
I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Mike Landers?
I'm good, thank you.
Mike and Sally Calhoun.
No questions, thank you.
Great, thank you. If you could unmute us, Jen. And I've got a motion from Ted Blake, seconded by Mike Landers, to move the assessing budget. Opposed? Steve?
Okay, next in the book on page 18 is the administrative services budget. The compensation adjustments there fit with a similar theme that we've talked about. The one footnote to this budget is as I think all of you know now, or if you don't, I'll be the first to tell you. Mr. Collins did announce that he would be retiring later this year after more than 40 years of service to the town. So we've budgeted a portion of the salary for that, and we have two very strong internal candidates for those positions to replace Joe. So there's the 1.65 increase. There's a lot of moving parts behind the scenes between the negotiated adjustments and the anticipated changes that'll have to be made once Joe retires this fall. We are expecting, we have 3 elections this year, and the tuition reimbursement at the bottom, as you can expect, we have some of the members of that department are pursuing. I believe one of them is looking at an MMA Suffolk program and a financial certificate program, and another is looking at starting a master's degree. So those are again areas that we try to protect. Investing in employees and their education is something that very consistently tried to do. So try to take any questions you have on this.
Great. Sally Calhoun?
Thank you. So, Steve, are you saying that with Joe Collins retiring, that you calculated that into the salaries and wages? There's anticipated a decrease in the result?
Yeah, there's a mitigating effect. It's more art than science. We have the philosophy here, at least for the past 5 years, has been that even when we have strong internal candidates, we like to advertise those positions and have them compete. And I think our recent example of that is Mark Carleo, who worked in our health department for 18 years. Peter Morandi retired, and Mark had to earn it. So he faced some stiff competition externally, and we ended up making the offer to him. So I know we have interested internal candidates who have acquitted themselves well and pursued all the right trainings. So I think, the odds are that Joe's replacements are already with us, but we have to prepare for the fact that may not be the case. But yes, this budget does, to the extent we can, we're trying to prepare for what the future of admin services looks like.
The other question I had really has to do with the elections, as you say. Is it too early to ask how you anticipate those are going to take place?
Joe and his staff have had, as you can imagine, a number of planning meetings for the local election that's coming up, and I think that will be a good pilot for us in terms of implementing, safe social distancing practices, recruiting. Our poll workers are a dedicated crew. Some of them fit neatly into the high-risk categories in terms of COVID-19. So it's been quietly a lot of work for Joe and his team on the backside to try to find new recruits to work the polls for us this year. So you should expect there will be a mask requirement. There will be markings on the floor so people know where to be, and egress will be managed closely. So we're going to have the local election in the field house this year. We generally do it in the Vi Gym, but we want to have as much space as possible for that. So in terms of the fall, I think it's too early to tell, but June 2nd will give us a pretty good feel for how that will work.
Kind of a related question, not directly to budget, but what about, I saw something about mail-in ballots are available. Can you explain how that works?
Yeah, so those, and you have to forgive me, I don't have the deadlines and dates in my head, but I can tell you that I think we ordered triple the normal number in anticipation of a high demand. Those have to be requested through the clerk's office before they can be mailed out. So if, and I don't know, Jen or Rodney, if you have any, you can help me with that. I think we're getting awfully close to the deadline for that, or it may have already passed. And I apologize for not having that at my fingertips.
But it's on the website for the town clerk.
And if you call the main line, we're monitoring that through the weekend, and we can answer that question. We get that answer.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Thanks, Sally. Mike Landers?
It's when guys like Joe retire, it's always sort of bittersweet because when I first started, I think Joe's probably the last guy who's left from when I first got involved with town government in the early '80s. So his moving on is great for him, but not for the town. He's always run a good budget and done a great job as Dan Toomey's right-hand man, and he learned from the best from that standpoint. So we'll miss him. Other than that, I'm okay.
Thanks. Ted?
Just clarification, the election increase is just purely driven by the number of elections?
Correct.
So that goes back down next year, or when there's less elections, that goes right back down?
Yeah, okay. Those generally ebb and flow. We did adjust. I believe we did an adjustment last week. Sometimes it's make a part adjustment what the poll workers are earning, but more elections equals more salary and wage.
Okay, that's all. I'm all set.
Thanks, Ted. Sally Kearns?
Yes, the end of an era when Joe Collins is moving on, because he is, for as long as any of us can remember, he's the last of the old guard. Don't tell him I said he was old, but no questions. I think we all do need to be very, my hat is off to the clerk's staff right now getting ready for an election in the middle of a pandemic. So that's all I've got.
Thanks, Sally. Mike Daly?
My questions were previously answered. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul Pollock?
Yes, just to clarify, there will be early voting for the town election. Is that correct?
Only by mail, yes. I mean, if you request a mail-in ballot, you can mail that in.
Okay, and you have to go to the town.
In a sense, you're thinking about, so the early voting for the state election, people could actually come to town hall and cast the ballot early. But this is the option you have for the locals, the mail-in.
It's just the mail-in, right? Okay.
But you'd have to request that through the clerk's office.
Sure. That's it. Other than Joe, congratulations. Thank you for all the work you've done over the years, and enjoy it. Enjoy it immensely. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Gina?
No real questions. I'm sure Joe will be missed and hard to fill his shoes. I think it seems like there's some unknowns with the elections, whether the mail-in process will need more manpower or less, or what's going to happen. So I think it's fine as is, as we just don't know what's going to happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Gina. And I think on behalf of all of us, I say it's unfortunate that Joe couldn't be here with us one last time to present his budget, but I'm sure we'll see him. We'll all see him either during our election or during town meeting. And if we could be unmuted for the motion. I have a motion from Gina McCusker, seconded by Ted Blake, to move the budget. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
Yeah, this is
Hold on.
ballot. See,
Yes, I'm sorry, you cut out.
okay, I'd like to answer the question about the ballots. Ballots must be returned to the local election office by election day. So get the application, fill it out, get the ballot, and return that by election day.
Great. Thank you, Dan.
Welcome.
All right, Steve, moving on. Are we going to Human Resources?
Yes, so this is the one with the moving parts that's related to the department head budget.
Right.
The first note is that the way that we draw a line between full-time and part-time employees is somewhat confusing. We had an employee who was working north of 30 hours a week, but less than what we considered full-time, so they had been budgeted for many years in the part-time line. We increased the hours for that position when we redesigned the job description last year, which moved it up into the full-time. So you'll see that the $59,000 position is zeroed out in this budget, and that is part of the increase up in the full-time. So the $128,000 increase there, when you tease out all of the HR functions, is actually a decrease from last year. So with the elimination of the director position, the upgrade of the assistant position, and the downgrade of the director position into the generalist position, there are budget savings, even though it shows up here as a $69,000 increase. So again, we have 3 positions budgeted in this. We have our full-time benefits coordinator, our full-time HR generalist, and our full-time HR assistant. Those are the 3 positions in this department. Some of the increases down below that I'd like to note: medical exams and advertising. Those represent consolidation of some expenses. So when we get to the public safety departments, for example, you'll see decreases there. We're trying to, and then this is kind of in the weeds, but if a particular department is trying to budget what they think they're going to need for medical exams in a given year based on who may or may not be retiring, an unexpected transfer, you end up over budgeting that because every department needs to be conservative in their estimate. Whereas we can do a report to look back 5, 6, 7 years to see what we've averaged, and by budgeting that here, more often than not, we'll have the right number budgeted, and the departments won't have to worry anymore about trying to guesstimate what that's going to be. So the increases in medical exams and to an extent in advertising, that is the advertising one is partially offset by the drop in personnel administration, which is a bit of a catch-all line for programs and costs that may be identified during the year. And then the uptick in the conference fees is there's a correlation there with the new staff. So we have new employees. We want to make sure that we can give them training opportunities, whether it's a half day, training opportunity in the middle of the state. So that's kind of the story in HR. So this budget and the department head budget are sort of linked at the hip this year in terms of what's happening across the budget.
Gina?
No question. Thank you.
Great. Paul?
You answered my question about medical exams, so thank you. Other than that, no question.
Mike Daly?
Well said.
Sally?
Me? I'm good.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Sally Kearns, yes.
I'm good. Thank you.
Ted Blake?
I'm good.
Great. Mike Landers? And Sally Calhoun?
Thank you. I'm all set. You've already answered all my questions.
Thank you. Jen, if you could unmute us all. I have a motion from Ted Blake, seconded by Gina McCusker, to move the HR budget. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Steve?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next on page 20 is the police budget. I probably won't get too deep into any of the particular line items here. I'll make more of a general statement. The increase in the wages here is below 2%. Part of that is, as we talked about, we've reached a tentative agreement. Ratification hasn't happened yet, but we have an agreement in place with the police union, which is below the typical COLA in response to what's happening. We've had some retirements in the department, so there's also there's a couple of things going on there. When you hire a new officer in, It's at a lower starting salary, but they also progress through some of the steps. So the net impact with the moving pieces is 1.87% for salaries. It's offset by some reductions in some of the lower incentives, which to a certain extent are tied to longevity. And as we've had some retirements, we, as expected, see some drops there. And then all the way down to the bottom, the overall budget is below 1.5% this year for the police department. So if there are specific questions, I think Ronnie and I can try to take those. But frankly, it's a level service budget for the police department this year.
Thanks, Steve. Sally Calhoun?
Thank you. I suppose, again, in the midst of a medical crisis, I noticed the decrease in the EMT incentive. Is there a reason for that? Is that shifting now to other areas than the police department budget?
No, that's a function of if you are an EMT, you qualify for the incentive. So we've had some turnover in the department, so we may have some younger officers who don't currently have that, and so that's a number that it goes up or down depending strictly on how many of our officers have the certification.
That was really the only question I had. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Mike Landers? Ted Blake?
No questions.
Sally Kearns?
Yeah, just want to confirm on and kudos to the employee unions for working hard to forego a larger increase. Does that affect retirement?
Yes, it does. I mean, when the retirement is based on depending on when you were hired, 3 or 5 years of your final salary. So indirectly, yes, it will over time.
Right.
It could.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Mike Daly?
85. There's 4 more cruisers, police vehicles. Is that quite an increase, isn't it? Over 50,000 apiece?
Are you looking in the capital section now, Mike?
Capital outlay, yeah.
Back.
4 police vehicles.
So we generally do 4 or 5 cruisers a year.
Yeah.
We've deferred. So that's not. I mean, we can. Do you want to wait and talk capital at the end, or do you want to?
Why don't we hold off, Steve, and talk about the capital outlay when we get there? And so Mike, if you could just keep your questions to the actual police budget for right now.
No, police vehicles, but never mind. Okay.
Right, but yeah.
No questions.
Okay, great, thank you. Paul Pollock?
I'm all set, CR. Thank you.
Great. And Gina?
Can you remind me what the specialist pay is for and why we had a spike last year? I'm sorry, I can't remember. Last year jumped to 68,000. This year it's down a little bit. I just can't remember what it was for.
I'm just checking the line. I'm looking at the history on it.
$51910. It's last year jumped from 36 to 68,000. This year we're down to 57,000. I just can't remember. The 400.
Off the top of my head, I can't either, but I suspect that Rodney's probably already texting the police chief, who's going to get us the answer.
Is that the psychologist?
The budget amount. Yeah. No, it's an incentive for staff. Let me check on the exact incentive, but the 68,000 would have been the budgeted amount, I think, in FY20, whereas the year before was the actual, the 36,000.
Okay.
What?
That was my only question.
We're asking we're going to get an answer as we speak.
Okay.
It could be the mental health, it could be the crisis intervention, but we want to double check.
Okay. That would make sense. Thank you.
The only question I have, I was just surprised to see an increase in unleaded gasoline, given that gas prices are going down.
If we could buy a full year's worth of gas today, we would be able to drop that number. But we have to, when we, unfortunately, when we start this process, we're about 18 months out trying to determine what the price of fuel is going to be. So that's based on, Dave Lane and his crew use a couple of different sources to try to guess where we're going to be. And they generally kind of blend what the projections are. So this number would account for both the cheap prices today, and I can inform you that every fuel tank we have is filled to the brim today. We wish we had larger fuel storage tanks right now at the DPW yard, but we don't. So it's up a little bit, but that's also looking out to next June, a year from now.
Was that long enough of a time to get the answer for the specialist?
It was the perfect amount of time to get me the answer on the specialist pay. Thank you. This is a number of different things. It covers stipends for our DARE officers, the detectives, and stipends for being an accredited police department. So it's blended.
Yeah.
And I just received a text from David Lane as well that the budgeted price per gallon right now, based on our projections, is $2.74 a gallon.
Noted. Nice to know he's one of the 50 or so people tuning in.
Yeah, I guess we should have noted we voluntold our department heads to be watching, so they are driving up viewership a little bit.
Great. Well, it's nice to have all of them with us. If you could unmute us, Jen. Thank you. And I have a motion from Sally Kearns, seconded by Michael Landers, to move the police budget. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
I miss seeing all those department heads, by the way.
Believe it or not,
Hopefully we'll have them back soon.
So the fire department budget is a very similar story to the police department. Credit to the membership for helping us solve the budget problem. So they have there's a below at least what has been the norm the last few years salary adjustment there. And then again, the overall budget here is about 1.7%. And I would be happy to take any questions, or sure. I guess I should note, since we're on fire, that Bob Pyburn retired this spring. That was another, he had planned his retirement late last year, not knowing that there was a public health crisis coming our way. He and I had a number of conversations and ultimately determined that that was his plan. He wanted to honor it. We wanted to make sure he honored that. So Deputy Chief Bob Amaral stepped up as our acting chief in the midst of this crisis and has done a phenomenal job. So we have, when it's safe to do so, we will be doing an assessment center for both chief and deputy chief. We had planned to do that in March, and that obviously got delayed as the pandemic started. So there will be some changes at the top in that department this year.
Gina?
Last year we had, I hate to ask about something I had last year, but why is the fire department doing traffic control? We've got $5,000 budget and salaries for that, as opposed to the police. Are those details?
So that's if we had to pay to have details for work that, like our the alarm. We have an alarm specialist who still manages hardwire fire alarm systems at public buildings and at some commercial properties. So
Okay.
those are they pay for those services, but we have to have a place to charge off some of those expenses as well.
Okay, thanks. No other questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Gina. Paul?
Yeah, just one quick question, Steve. When you will replace the chief, do you also go outside, or is it basically from within, or you do have options?
So the chief positions are in both departments are part of civil service.
Say that again, please.
Those positions are both subject to civil service. So those are internal those are internal recruitment processes. So any officer above a certain rank is qualified to sign up to participate in the assessment center to be considered for either of the positions.
Within the present department?
Yep.
Right, okay. Are you restricted, as to going outside the town, or are you pretty, is that what you're saying, you have to work inside?
So going way back to spring of 2015, my first town meeting, Chief Neil Willett had retired, and there was a proposal supported by the selectmen and the finance committee to remove the police chief from civil service so that internal candidates and external candidates would both compete for the position. Town meeting voted it down by, I think, a 9-vote threshold. So
now you refreshed my memory. I can remember that now too. Yep. Yes. Okay, I'm all set. Other than that, thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Michael Daly,
No questions.
Sally Kearns,
No questions. Good, thank you.
thanks, Sally. Ted Blake,
I don't have any questions.
Mike Landers,
I'm good. We'll just keep that civil service issue something for another time. Paul and I can talk privately about that.
and Sally Calhoun.
Thank you. One question in the fire budget is the elimination of medical expenses. Why does that come out?
So this is related to the increase in the HR budget, where we've shifted the medical exam, medical expense. So we're consolidating those expenses in the HR budget so that fire doesn't have to try to predict what they'll need each year.
Thank you. And then another question that a citizen posed to me, and I wasn't sure if I should pose it with the police or the fire budget, but the question has to do with why homeowners that have an alarm system are charged a fee or a tax for having a system. You know anything about that, or where I could go to get the information for?
So we have we monitor a number of alarm systems in town, and there is the selectmen updated a fee schedule, I think 3 or 4 years ago, for false alarms, which may not be what you're describing. I don't have that. I don't have an answer. I suspect while we're talking, one of the chiefs can comment. You're talking about a private home security system, and a fee is collected by either police or fire.
Well, I wasn't sure which, and they was telling me they've never had a false alarm ever, and he doesn't understand why he's charged. It may not be an appropriate question for our body. I can look into it, another time, but I promised that I would bring it up.
The question has been texted, and we'll see, I'm sure we'll get an answer momentarily.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all I have.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Jen, if you could unmute us, please. Okay. We have a motion from Sally Kearns, seconded by Ted Blake, to move the fire budget. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Steve, before we move on to the Inspectional Services budget, we have a question from town meeting member Bates. And it's going back to assessing the general office supplies line up 300%. He just wanted that explained.
Sure. I'm flipping right now to the. I know what it is, but I just want to put my eyes on it before I answer. The increase there is actually to replace. There's a heavy duty printer that the assessing department uses when they generate all of their mailings, and it has failed a couple of times and has required repair. So this is to replace that printer, which we'll probably get another 10 to 15 years out of once it's replaced. So that increase there, for lack of a better line item in that particular budget, that's where that expense ended up. So we'll see that this year, and that'll fall off next year.
And Steve, I don't know if you can hear me. I'm having an audio problem. I'm just going to ask Sally to start the inspectional services, and I'll try to get back in.
Okay, thank you. Well, Inspectional Services starts on page 22. Steve, did you have an introduction for us?
Before we do inspectional, Sally, if you could encourage the resident to reach out either to me or to Jen or to the fire chief, we can try to help them. The fire chief's position, his answer was similar to my own, which is that we do monitor commercial systems. We don't monitor private. So I'd like to know more about that, and so we can give a proper answer.
Thank you very much.
Inspectional services, the number here that sticks out is an increase in the part-time salary, and I'd like to explain that. One of our assistant building official has been with us for many, many years. It is likely that he will retire at some point in the not too distant future. And the building inspector, Rich Maloney, has requested funding for a part-time position so that we can, at some point, and again, this fits squarely into the explanation I provided on IT. We'd like to be able to bring somebody on to overlap a little bit. So, Dave has, nearly 3 decades of service with us. And as I had mentioned last night, this is a department that, quite honestly, is probably busier now than it was before March 12th, if that makes any sense. But they're humming, and so the request here would be to bring this part-time position on to effectively overlap and audition for the assistant position, at which point a retirement would eliminate the need for the position. So I don't think it's something we'll fill right away, but it's one that we, from succession planning perspective, it's a small but important position to be looking at.
Thank you. Paul, can we start with you for any questions?
Sure. I don't have any questions, but thank you very much. I think it's a very well-prepared budget.
Thank you. Gina, do you have anything?
No, no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike Daly?
I have no questions.
Thank you. Mike Landers?
Good, thank you, Sally.
Thanks. Sally Cairns?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you. Ted, do you have any questions?
No, I don't. Thank you very much.
CR, are you available to hop in with any?
Yeah, I'm back in. Thank you. I have no questions.
Neither do I. And with our motions in front of you?
I do. We have a motion by Mike Landers, seconded by Sally Kearns, to move the Inspectional Services budget. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Great. And Sally, thank you for filling in there while I experienced my my technical difficulty. I appreciate it.
No worries.
Steve, moving on to Public Works.
So Public Works tax supported. Getting feedback now. I think without the headphones, CR was giving some feedback. So I'll run through it, and then I'll mute myself. So this is, I'm gonna speak broadly to this, and then I think Dave Lane is probably warming up his thumbs as we speak for some of the questions that I won't be able to answer. But I would describe this as a level service budget. The Public Works Department hours won't be changing on July 1st like some of the office settings. And I want to acknowledge here, as I did last night, as well as with police and fire, that the members in the Public Works unions understand where we are and have agreed to some below market COLAs to try to make the budget this year work, which is reflected in the fact that the overall full-time salaries are only going up by 1.63%. Overall salary and wages is only up a little under 1.25% this year. Some of the bigger changes you see in the budget, some of our costs for utility and cleaning services are up. We're seeing a slight downward trend in our snow and ice based on several mild winters. So we generally budget those, based on a rolling average. We try to shave the highs and the lows to keep it. We don't want to chase last year's winter and predicting the next year's, but certainly recency matters. So that's down a little bit. Some of the utility costs are up a little bit. Overall, the budget is at 1.55%. And I think I'll stop there, and we were happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you. Gina
Yeah, the on-call public works is going up 40%. That's line 51423. Why is that going up? And then also the oil, let's see, gas heating line is up 19%. Can you speak to those?
Yeah, so the on-call, that was an adjustment that was made as part of the recent negotiations. So that was a contractual obligation. An adjustment was made there based on market, and any adjustment in the natural gas line would be driven by the cost projections looking out over the next year. Is that the line? Yeah.
Yeah, also, you mentioned contract cleaning. Is that also an agreement?
So that's a service we bid. So the price is a function of the bids that we receive.
Okay, thank you.
Paul?
Yes, there was an increase in security systems, I believe. So that was a question I had. And then the other one was the recycling. I think recycling didn't show anywhere. It just looks like it's a new item.
Recycling is not new. Do you have a line item, Paul? I want to make sure I'm looking at the.
I'm looking for it now. Yeah, I have it as 54312, and it's not. It's a $5,000, but it looks like it's from 2017 on, zeros all the way through. I was just curious. To me, it looked like it was a new item.
So, I think Dave will probably correct me by the time I finish answering this.
Okay.
But if you look on the previous page, we have about a $200,000 line item for the recycling program.
What page is that? 23?
That's the previous page on 23. I believe this may have to do with materials that our materials coordinator uses in marketing and advertising and trying to generate additional participation in our recycling program, because it saves us a good bit of money on our tipping fees when people do that.
Right.
And so my recollection from early in the process is that this is a new cost. We wanted to provide some resources to that position to do this work, because in the end, it saves us a considerable amount of money on our tipping fees.
Okay. And right now, that's it for me with the Public Works. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Michael Daly?
No question, it's just a comment that a few months ago, I was able to attend a tour of the new building on Canal Street. And I thought that outstanding work went into it. It was very well built, very well thought out. And I'm sure the employees are going to really enjoy it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Sally?
Me? I can't hear you.
Sally Kearns.
I can't hear you. Okay. Before March, I had anticipated, as I thought through upcoming FinCom, and I was going to ask about the possibility of adding composting to our recycling program, and I'm sure we cannot do that right now. But I'm just going to give a plug. If we can down the road, obviously not now, unless it's a money saver, that would be great. I asked last year, and I can't recall the answer. Are we in what year of our 10-year contract are we in? And it's very good news to me to hear you say that it saves us money on tipping fees. I'm very confused about what is actually recycled, and it's no knock on the town, but I do it and I think, is any of this really, I don't know if anyone saw the Frontline special on plastics. It was horrifying. So can we be confident that what we are recycling is in fact being recycled? Is it a money saver? And might we be able to consider composting 5 years or so from now?
We've been looking at composting, and you may not have to wait 5 years.
Right.
I believe we're 1 or 2 years out on the contract, and I think Dave will text me in the next 30 seconds or so to confirm that. We're confident that the recycling that's taken out of Danvers is sorted, and we don't follow it to its final resting place. I think in addition to the Frontline special about the backstory on recycling, there's the fact that everybody's aware of at this point that the international market for recycling essentially collapsed 2 years ago. And David just confirmed we are 8 years into our 10-year contract. So when this problem emerged 2 years ago and we were 6 years into our contract, I think we had a high level of confidence that it was going to resolve itself before it reared up to bite us. We're a little less confident now. We still have 2 years. But this is I have some colleagues in the western part of the state that have been essentially saying to the MMA and others, our new contracts, it's more expensive to recycle than throw it away. And so we have $3 million operating budgets. We're not going to recycle if this is the case because we can't afford to. And you'll also be pleased to know David has been to the site in Saugus where it is sorted, and he is confirming for us that it is in fact recycled. So thank you, David.
That's very good news. Plastic cups, cardboard trays that you get from takeout. Of course, we're generating so much more because of the COVID crisis, and we have to. There's no getting around. We're generating more of it because that's keeping restaurants going, at least with takeout. But is it all being, the plastic containers, as long as they have any kind of triangle, or does it have to have a 3 or a 6 or a?
You're gonna.
I know. Maybe David will text you while we're waiting.
He will, but I do know at an MMA board of directors meeting last year, none other than the commissioner of the DEP himself dispelled the notion that you can't recycle a greasy pizza box. So.
I compost mine with.
Yeah,
I would be remiss if I didn't give a plug to. I signed up 4 months ago with Black Earth Composting. Yep. I think there are 40 of us in the town of Danvers who use their service. So if more people sign up, we'll save a little bit of money. Pizza boxes, everything. Paper towels that are used, as long as it's a wonderful, wonderful. And it's very gratifying to see a lot less rubbish going out on the curb because we pay. So thank you. Thank you, David Lane, for whatever additional light you can shed on the recycling.
Well, he's also texting me now to ask me to reiterate how important it is to sort your recycling when it goes to the curbside. We have published guidelines. You can find them on the website. Our DPW is pretty active on social media. So it's important to make sure that we're following the recycling etiquette and guidelines that we're bound by in our contract with the haulers. And he also noted that part of that recycling expense, $5,000 that Paul asked about, is the recycling bins that we sell, and some of those costs are reimbursed. But we do purchase the bins out of there as well.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sally. Ted?
The one question I have, Steve, and I guess David too, given where we are in year 8 of the contract and what you mentioned about the importance of people actually sorting and doing it correctly, is there a benefit to really pushing hard on people to improve that in the next 2 years before we renew the contract? Or, I mean, I guess only our current provider would know if we've improved, but especially if it looks like recycling might be costing more than throwing it away.
Yeah, I mean, what we know is that I think the hauler is losing money on Danvers right now on the recycling side. So it is in our best interest to recycle as much as we can because it reduces our tipping fee. I think it's a very open and very worrying question about what the next contract will look like. So we are actively discussing that right now with our haulers to see if they have thoughts or ideas. But you know, the recycling issue is one that is it has the attention of the commissioner, the DP, the governor's aware of it. You know, the MMA, the Mass Municipal Association, has stated it as one of its key policy points. I believe Newburyport had their contract come up within the past 2 years, and they were facing a potential 40% increase in their costs. So it's a big problem, and it's not affecting. Again, we haven't faced it yet, but we're getting it. But Dave, you know, we've had ongoing conversations with the haulers about whether there are creative ways to extend this contract in a way that's mutually beneficial. But at some point, you know, the international recycling markets are way outside of influence at the local level. So there's going to have to be some to the higher levels of government to figure that out.
And what's the dollar value of a 40% increase for us if that were to happen?
So we're north of $1 million between collection and disposal right now. So you know, it could be $400,000.
Okay, that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted. Mike Landers?
Steve, can you have Dave tell us why we have to pay $1,700 for weather services and he just can't watch Channel 5 in the morning?
It looks like his battery just died, Mike. I'm sorry. I'm sure he'll answer the question. Give him a minute.
Other than that, I'm okay.
Okay, thanks.
While we're waiting for that, Sally, Calhoun, do you have any questions?
Thank you. Yes. Just two of the large reductions in the budget include snow removal equipment, quite a large reduction. Is that because last year we purchased some extra? I'm just not sure why it's down as far as it is.
No, so we budget that. We have there's the snow costs are spread between a number of different lines. We have the removal equipment, materials. We have overtime costs up top, and we budget those based on a rolling multi-year average. And so, if we have a couple of mild winters in a row, as we have, those numbers would start to tick down a little bit. But we don't necessarily use the raw numbers. So, as an example, the winter from 2015-16. When I believe in February, I made the great mistake of bragging about we were only 20% through our snow budget, and then we had nonstop snow for the months of February, March, and I think even into April, and we ended up about $1 million in the red in our snow operation. We don't include that gross number in our planning for future year budgets. We cap it, so we try to take a rolling average, but we also try to be mindful of the fact that that was a highly unusual winter. We haven't seen anything like it since. But the drops there are simply based on averages over the last handful of years.
So the line that's entitled snow removal equipment doesn't necessarily mean trucks and equipment that we have here in the town, but could that include contracting with fellows with trucks that come around and plow?
Yep.
And then the other one was the landfill consultant, which is reduced significantly. Is that because that work is coming to an end, or?
No, sadly, that work. Sadly, sadly, that work will never end. When we capped our landfill, we have an ongoing monitoring obligation with the DP. So we have methane burners there that burn the gas that comes out of the ground, and we've had a lot of issues with those burners over the years. So we work closely with DP to try to get a system that works. So you'll note that in 19 our actual was around 70. I think we increased it because if you look at the trend there, it had been going up and up. But thankfully we've plateaued at this point. So we're hopeful that it'll stay there and it'll only increase incrementally. But that's an obligation we accepted when we capped our landfill.
Thank you. Those are the only questions that I had.
Mr. Chairman, David Lane wanted me to remind Mike Landers that if the meteorologist we have on contract is right and can save us even 1 hour of plowing operation, it more than pays for that. So he only needs to be right 1 hour a year to justify the expense.
Thank you. And thank you, Dave. Okay, if we could be unmuted for the motion to vote. I have a motion from Mike Landers, seconded by Gina McCusker, to move the Public Works tax supported budget. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
So moving on to page 25, the Sewer Enterprise Fund. This of course is a non-tax operation. It's fully self-supporting through the water and sewer rates that we collect. This budget is down, and if you scan toward the bottom of the page, you'll quickly see that it's because our assessment from the South Essex Sewerage District is down this year, $118,000. So it's essentially a level funded budget. The employees in this department belong to the same union as Public Works, so they similarly made concessions as part of the recent agreements that were put in place. So I think I would be happy to try to answer any questions you have, and I know David, who's waiting in the wings, would also be ready to answer questions.
Thank you. Sally Calhoun?
Thank you. Yes, that the reduction in the South Essex Sewerage District is the thing that leaves out in this budget. Is there a particular reason that it's come down so much? I know that some has been kind of climbing in an alarming way over the years, but is there a reason that this year it's down?
So the assessment is a combination of operating costs and then debt service that would be associated with Danvers specific improvements. So it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily mean that the operating budget decreased at sewer at Essex. We could have had some old projects drop off. Sometimes it goes up if you're anticipating a project. So that would be the general answer to the question. Most likely there's some expenses that have fallen off because debt was retired or something of that nature. But as we move on, I think David can confirm or correct that.
Is there a chance that that downward trend will remain?
No, sorry. I mean, we do have, there's a fairly large project. One of our sewer interceptors is going to need a major overhaul next couple of years. So we will see that turn around. And so the way, the South Essex District has a treatment plant in Salem. And so all of the member communities share in the cost to operate that plant and all of the capital and rolling stock and everything that goes into running the plant. Then there are separate fees charged for projects that are specific to that member district. So a couple of years ago, Marblehead faced a significant emergency expense when one of their sewer interceptors near the ocean failed. And so they had an emergency assessment against Marblehead to fix that. The other members didn't have to pay for that because that was part of the Marblehead system. So we have some costs that belong solely to us and then other costs that we share in.
So now on page 26, a lot of the items are bonds. And I suppose we ask you to do this every year, but could you just explain how those work and how they impact the budget? There's increases, there's decreases. Just kind of a general overall without going into specific bonds, just how this part works.
Yeah, so when we get to the debt budget, Rodney will probably speak more eloquently than I will about how the debt works here. But we're constantly when we're determining what types of capital projects we can take on in our sewer budget or water budget, we're looking at a couple of things. We're looking at our retained earnings position, which is essentially like free cash for them that we use to fund some of our capital. We're looking at their existing debt load to see if we can layer in new projects. So town meeting in recent years has approved, they've authorized water and sewer to issue debt for main replacement and things like that. And then the timing of those issuances are what impact the budget that you're looking at right now. So projects approved, 3, 4, 10, 15 years ago are going to be reflected in here at whatever part of the debt retirement stage that particular project is on.
Is there an equivalent of retained earnings shown on this 2-page budget? These 2 pages, 25 and 26?
No, we have financial policies that speak to those that will are in the budget book themselves. Ronnie, do you want to think? Obviously, the audit talks about those, but
Yes, our policy is to have 10% of the next year's budgeted revenue in retained earnings, which we generally do. Right now, we have about roughly 1.5 million in both sewer and then 1.5 million in water for retained earnings. And then just to touch base on the debt for the sewer, what we're seeing right now is phasing on that $4 million authorization from a couple of years back. Those projects are well underway, so now we're starting to see, after permanently financing, that hit our debt books now.
Sally, though, in terms of it being like free cash, it is actually part of our free cash certification each year. So when the Department of Local Services certifies our free cash at the end of the calendar year, it also certifies the retained earnings in water and sewer.
Is a separate item or included within our?
Those are tracked separately.
Okay. But it doesn't show for purposes of the budget documents.
No, when we talk about the warrant next week, some of the capital project recommendations will be funded through sewer retained earnings or sewer receipts or things like that, and we can speak to that. Go through those.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's
Mike Landers?
Nope, I'm good, thank you. Nope, I'm good, thank
Ted
you.
Blake?
I'm good, thank you.
Sally Kearns?
Just did wonder, item 57505, reduction in health and dental costs, meaning, what is that?
So when we're gonna we'll get to the benefits budget in a couple of minutes. That's related to the health plan redesign that we did. One of the things, we have about 700 and I want to say 750. I'm close. We have about 750 members on our health plans between the schools and the town. And as part of the migration from Tufts to Maya, and as part of the process of developing our new plan designs, we discovered that a number of utility employees were being charged off to the general fund, and in this case, I believe we found that some sewer employees were being either charged off that a non-sewer employee was probably being picked up here. So that I believe that shift is just moving the benefits to where they belonged in the first place. So it's kind of a byproduct of the process is that we identified a number of employees that had been miscoded when they were hired. This could go back 10, 15 years ago. So we're just putting the pieces where they belong.
Okay, it's not a reduction in benefits or something?
Nope.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Mike Bailey?
I have no questions.
Thanks, Mike. Paul Pollock?
My questions have already been answered. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And Gina McCusker?
I see that capital outlay is down 67%. Is that because we've begun to replace all the water mains and we're doing all the upgrades that we did in the warrant articles last year? And where are we at in the water main replacements? Have we begun all of them?
So the water main replacements would be in the next budget, not this budget. I think the drop in capital is probably quite simply based on what was due to be replaced in the capital plan and what we had for available retained earnings. So we can, when we get to the capital section, I think we'll be able to speak to what that $55,000 replacement is this year.
So of all the warrant articles that we approved last year, they have not necessarily began spending all of those. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. So particularly with the bond authorizations, I believe, and Rodney can correct me, I think the town meeting authorized, I think $4 million for sewer and 8 million for water.
10 million for water, 4 million for sewer, a couple of larger projects like the Frostfish Phase 1 and 2, but those are the big enterprise fund debt projects.
But in terms of timing, so we would receive the bond authorization in year one. We may only bond $800,000 a year for 10 years.
Okay.
But what it does is having the authorization allows us to do capital planning more than 1 year at a time, which helps in terms of projects, project scale and timing our bids and being able to get contractors in town to do the work.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Gina. If we could be unmuted for the vote. Again, thank you. Can I have a motion from Ted Lake, seconded by Sally Kearns, to move the sewer enterprise fund budget? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Steve?
Water is a little bit more complicated than the sewer budget. It's a larger operation. We have our treatment plant in Middleton, and we maintain all of the water lines in Danvers. On the salary side, similar story to what we've been talking about. Amidst the moving pieces, the overall year over year is 1.95%. If we flip to the second page on page 28, you'll see the opposite of what we saw in the sewer department. So the insurance is actually up considerably in the water department, and that is because we identified some employees who had been charged off to the general fund that were water department employees. So we've corrected that in this budget. So we saw a decrease in the sewer budget for that. We're seeing a significant increase in the water budget for that. We also identified some electric employees who had been coded to the general fund years ago. So when we talk electric, we'll be able to identify that as well. Otherwise, we're seeing some slight increase in debt service here, but really the budget driver, the benefits correction accounts for about half of the increase in the water budget this year.
Thanks, Steve. Gina?
You did answer my question about the benefits. Why are the treatment chemicals going up 33% or 75,000? And also one more. I guess that's it for now, the chemicals.
So part of the explanation there, and if I talk slowly enough, Dave will fill in whatever I get wrong, as has been the case for the last couple of budgets. So when we upgraded our treatment plant, we were initially using an alternative to chlorine and ozone treatment as part of what the DEP was looking for in the operation of that plant. It's been an ongoing learning process. So we've actually switched back to a chlorine-based treatment system. And David has also informed me we've started introducing a new corrosion control chemical into the process based on the experience that we're seeing at the plant. So that's a line that has, I think if we look at it, has increased considerably. Our actual for 19 was 297,000. So really this increase is bringing it to where we were a year and a half ago.
Right.
And this is great. If I fumble long enough, I get all the information from David. The other point he made just now in the text is that we have requirements that we have to meet for lead and copper regulations. So the chemical treatment process up there is ever changing. So they're literally 50-gallon drums. There's an entire room, and the 24/7 staff up there is constantly trying to perfect and balance what they're putting into the water. So
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Gina. Paul?
I'm fine with the budget. I have one other question though for Steve or David. Have you seen an increase in water use due to COVID-19 with children being home, parents being home? And is there a possibility that could affect our water usage throughout the summer and into the fall?
I think that's an excellent question. We've actually posed that question ourselves. So we We needed to get, ideally you want to have more than 1 month of data to look at. I think anecdotally, what we know is that residential use for water and electric is probably up right now because so many people are at home. But we also would expect that commercial use would be down. And I think David is confirming that right now. So the anecdotal question that we had is whether the increase in residential use would offset the decrease in commercial use. Commercial is down, so we have March and April now to look at, and we can compare last year to this year. So I don't think that the increase in residential is going to offset that loss in commercial, and use in the summer also is largely a function of the weather.
Right. Okay,
I will
thank
tell
you.
you that we do know anecdotally, we've seen about 3 times as many pool permits coming through code this year as usual. A lot of those people buy their water and have it delivered, so we may not, that may not help us as much as we would like to think on the sales side. But really summer sales is a function of weather, but if everyone is still at home all day, every day in the summer, that certainly will have an impact as well.
All right, thank you. I'm all set here.
Thanks, Paul. Michael Daly?
52904, I think you mentioned contract cleaning before. But,
Yeah, this is a service that's put out to bid every 3 years or so, and the increase is a function of the bid results.
substantial. 5309 consulting services. Went up 30,000.
I believe well, David, I think I know the answer to that. I'm going to wait for David to tell me the answer to that. He also pointed out that part of the increase in the cleaning cost, Mike, is because we're now doing the water sewer that we weren't doing before. So the Canal Street building, part of that increase is because there's an additional building.
Okay, yeah.
And I believe the consulting services has to do with the permit renewal, but I would like to let David confirm that. So I'll respond to that when I get confirmation.
Okay. Gasoline, we already talked about that. Travel allowance. Really? 7,200 plus? That's 57,101.
So I believe, Mike, part of that, we have positions that have historically been offered a town vehicle or a stipend, and a number of employees are choosing a stipend versus a town vehicle, which has an impact on the operating budget, but certainly, if you can downsize your fleet by truck, that works well. In terms of consulting services, so it's a combination of both our water permit, which we have to renew this year. We actually have our draft order to complete from DEP, and we've responded to some of their concerns, but we also have new monitoring consulting requirements because of the PFAS situation that we're wells. We've had the PFAS chemicals show up in our wells. So we're using some outside consultants to help us figure out what the fix for that is going to be.
And that's under transportation?
No, I'm sorry, that's under consulting. I was going back.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
57,505 health and dental costs.
Yeah, so that's the one I mentioned when we were going through the process of migrating our health plan from one carrier to another and looking at the redesign. We identified quite a few employees who, when they were hired, had been coded off. They've been picked up by the general fund. So when we get to the benefits, we can talk about that. The decrease that we're showing there is not as great as it appears, because part of the story is that a number of employees who had been captured in the general fund have been put back where they belong in either water or electric. So that increase is just employees who had been charged off to the general fund are now being charged off to the water budget where they belonged from the get-go.
Okay, I guess that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. we'll go to Sally Kearns.
Thank you. All covered by previous questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Ted,
I'm all set, thank you.
Mike Landers,
I'm good, thank you very much.
thanks, Mike. And Sally Calhoun.
Thank you. On page 28, there's a reference to the State Hospital Reservoir and the Folly Hill Reservoir. Are those both bond matters? Is it listed? Okay. So these line items reflect an increase in the payment on the bonds in the coming year.
Any increase, yes, any increase or decrease there is based on the debt schedule.
And then lower down, there's interest on water mains. Earlier, when we were dealing with the sewer budget, I think Gina asked about the water main work. That's not reflected here though, right? Because this was,
So you'll see the second to the last project there. Ronnie, do you want to jump in? There's a
Sure.
little.
What you're seeing is we financed some of that first $10 million project. So it was set up to go about $2.5 million per year in spending. So we've started spending that. We've incurred the cost. We permanently financed that back in August. So we have a first interest payment due next year.
We have a very creative tracking system for these. If you look at the little numbers by the description, it'll tell you the month and year that the debt was issued. So 59,173, you'll see water mains 819. So that was a string of zeros, and now we're starting to pay some principal for that first issuance. And then down at the bottom is the corresponding interest. So you'll see interest water mains 819, and that would be the interest on that debt.
and then the interest on temporary loans, is that the AN, AN?
Yeah, so in addition to permanently financing, sorry, we took out some bands as well as part of that project.
Thank you. One last question. Again, it came up in the sewer budget as well. The capital outlay of 75,000. Does that reflect on our capital outlay page here?
The 50,000 is captured there. So the 50,000 that we're spending is there. Yes.
I'm sorry, say that again, Steve.
The proposed spending for fiscal year 2021 of $50,000 would be included in the capital outlay at the back of the budget.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thanks, Sally. Jen, if you could unmute us, please. I have a motion from Michael Landers, seconded by Sally Kearns, to move the budget. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. It is 20 now. We've really been putting our town manager, I think, through the ringer. He's been doing a fantastic job answering our questions. He probably needs a break. So why don't we take 10 minutes and reconvene at 8:30 to continue on with the budget hearings. So we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Thank you.
is attributable to the replacement of Peter Morandi. As we long expected, it took two people to replace Peter Morandi, both in terms of personality and job duties. But he for many years served as our Director of Public Health and our Veterans Services Officer due to his service in the Coast Guard. And he did that job very well. We had a very unique model in Danvers, but for a number of years, in working with the state, we knew that at his retirement, based on our size and based on our veterans base, that we were likely going to be moving to a standalone VSO position. So when Peter retired, Kelly Reyes Teixeira, who is an employee of many years, worked down in the Administrative Services Department. She's a Marine, very active with our veterans community on the North Shore. She applied for and was successful in becoming our new VSO. She's put together, working with the Danvers Veterans Council and DCAT, a fantastic virtual program, which is going to be aired on Monday because we won't be able to celebrate Memorial Day the way that we normally do. So between her moving into this budget and Mark Carleo being promoted from Assistant Health Director to the Health Director, we see an increase here, and it's attributable to both of those promotions. So the increase was net, not gross, but with Peter's retirement, we added a new VSO position and upgraded Mark's position. So that explains much of that. There's also moving around within the salary and wage line. There's a part-time position that had been charged off to the Senior Transportation Fund, which is a revenue-generating fund. This was a position that provided support to both that service area and the senior center. Several years ago, when we allocated those costs across the two accounts, I think we overestimated, both in terms of the impact it would have on the fund and the job duties, how much of the time was spent on transportation versus general duties. So we've shifted a portion of that position back into the general fund, where we feel it more appropriately belongs. So that explains the increase in the salary and wages line. It's those three things. I'll draw your attention to it's a small decrease, but the phone system going down back earlier this evening when we talked about the IT budget and the increase there. This is reflective of some of the cost consolidation. So as we move closer and closer to virtual, voice over internet protocol phone system that's standardized across the organization, eventually that will live in the IT department, but we're in the midst of that migration process. So those pieces are moving. And then down at the bottom, we have, Mark Carleo is pursuing his master's in public health. That was one of the conditions when we promoted him. He had been working on it, and we essentially said, as part of your new role here, we expect you to complete that degree. So the tuition at the bottom there, the 5,000 increase, is to support his pursuit of that degree that we required him to pursue. So happy to take any questions you have on the land use community services budget at this time.
Thanks, Steve. Sally Calhoun.
So again, Steve, I'm just trying to get used to the idea, and without of this new designation, I know it's not so new, but without the cheat sheet narrative next to it, land use and community services is planning, senior services, public health, veteran services. Is that it?
That's it. And the only cost associated with those service areas that is not reflected here is our Chapter 115 veterans benefits. That was moved into the benefits and insurance budget, I think 4 town meetings ago, because it was a sizable. For a number of years, we saw that account growing, and it was having an impact on this budget because it's a smaller budget. So the veteran service officer is budgeted here. Some of the celebratory events and materials for that position are here, but the benefits themselves are reflected in the other budget.
One other item that shows a big, percentage increase anyway is animal control. Is there a reason for that?
So that's fully off. I think the line below it goes down by the same amount for pest control. So we're simply breaking that cost out. So that's budget neutral.
What's the difference between animal control and pest control?
geese versus mice mostly. I think a lot of our pest control costs go to chasing geese. And this is a moment where I miss Peter because he would have given us a dissertation on how loud noises, or even, I think, purple Kool-Aid, believe it or not, is a terrific goose deterrent, and he would have talked to us at length about that.
Will the public health staff be involved at all, do you think, in upcoming testing and planning for purposes of the COVID-19?
So yeah, I mean, I'd like to. I'm going to seize the opportunity you just gave me to make a plug. Mark Carleo, Judith Ryan, who is our public health nurse, and all of the school. I want to acknowledge the work that the school nurses have been doing in support of our public health department. Since the schools closed early on, when the testing started to become more available, and the local requirements for contact tracing started to increase, the school nurses all volunteered and jumped at the opportunity to work with Judith Ryan and Mark, and the work that they've been doing to help us keep up with the contact tracing for COVID-19 has been just tremendous. Mark accepted his new role on March 16th, which was, of course, 3 days after we closed public buildings as the crisis was starting to unfold. So we talk about a trial by fire. He and Kelly Reyes Teixeira actually both started their new roles on March 16th under very different circumstances than they had expected. Mark's done a terrific job. Judith has done an outstanding job. And I suspect that they will continue to be, called upon easily for the months ahead. It's worth noting that one of the budgeted vacancies we have in that $650,000 figure that I mentioned earlier was Mark's old position. So he stepped into his new role as the health director and does not have an assistant supporting him. So really, we're down. We went into this crisis down a full-time employee in our health department, and certainly we've learned. I think you probably all heard this in the news, but the number of health department positions that have disappeared in America in the last 2 or 3 decades, and I think we're all realizing right now, much like a levee protecting a community from a flood or a hurricane, you don't appreciate it not being there until you need it. So he's doing a terrific job, and yes, I think their workload is going to continue to be very demanding for the foreseeable future.
So stuff like contract tracing tasks, is that assigned by the state to our local health department to do, or is it generated within our town?
For the most part, yes.
For the most part, which?
For the most part, we are responsible for it. I think when there were only a couple of dozen cases, it was easy for our staff to keep up with that. When the testing became more widespread, and for example, the National Guard would come in and administer tests to all residents and staff in a particular long-term care facility, some of what you're finding there is people who are asymptomatic are testing positive, and now there's a requirement to do contact tracing for that person, because even though they're asymptomatic, they could transmit it to somebody else. So the contact tracing demands started to increase exponentially. And I don't have, I can't speak to the finer details, but I know that the state is playing a role, through Mass Department of Public Health and other entities to assist with that. But it is largely a local responsibility to do the contact tracing.
So the state requires the town's public health department to do that contact tracing? Is that how it works?
I wouldn't necessarily say require in the sense that it's a mandate. It's our responsibility, and I think the partnerships have worked very well. So when we've had needs, we've been able to get support from MEMA, Mass Emergency Management, from Mass DPH, the governor's office. So we've been able to access support, local hospitals. So we've had support. So I wouldn't go as far as call it a mandate, but it's our local responsibility to make sure that if residents are potentially transmitting it, we want to be staying ahead of that.
Well, this gives me just opening to ask what are our current numbers and how are the long-term care facilities in our town doing?
We've been updating those numbers on Thursdays, so I haven't actually checked the website yet to see where we are. We, on a per capita basis, we're very high. But we also know that, you know, at one point, I think 3 out of 4 positive cases in Danvers were stemming from places, you know, the Hogan Center and a lot of our nursing homes. And I think that's both tragic because those are populations, you know, as we're learning in the news, and, you know, they're the most vulnerable, they're the most adversely impacted by this. But when you tease out the numbers outside of those facilities, it also tells you that I think the community has responded very well to the call for social distancing and, you know, limiting travel from home to essential needs, because outside of those, you know, long-term care facilities, our numbers are at or below the state average. And I can give you, I'll have an updated, I want to give you guys an updated case count, and I've asked Mark to provide that to me, so I'll report that in just a moment.
Those were all my questions.
Thanks, Sally. Mike Landers?
Steve, how in the two, and this also, I guess, goes back a little bit to Inspectional Services, with the two boards that we have, with I guess 3 in Conservation Commission as well. How is that going through all this? I know that there are mechanisms to delay certain actions. I'm not even sure that they've taken any remote, had any remote meetings, but have we had any action in regards to those boards and the support that we've been providing them through these departments?
So that's a very timely question. I'm going to be issuing a memo tomorrow to the staff that support those boards and committees. Rich Maloney, David Fields, Georgia Pendergast, the staff that support those committees have had a number of conversations with the chairs and the committee members, and we're going to have several options for those committees to choose from starting in early June to start reconvening their public hearings. We have quite a queue forming at the Planning Board and the Zoning Board of Appeals, as you can imagine. We had applications that had been filed just before this happened. We know that those folks are eager to be heard, and we're eager to hear them. So it's expected that in early June we'll see those meetings restart. And there's a second part to your question, and I'm trying to remember what it was.
Well, no, actually.
Yeah, so what the governor provided with the legislation that was passed, essentially what it said was all tolling permits. So in other words, everything that has a shot clock associated with it is effectively paused. And towns and cities have until 45 days after the governor lifts his declaration to restart those processes. So that was the cover that towns and cities needed to get their feet underneath them and figure out how this was going to work remotely. But we're now ready, and we don't see a need to delay those processes. You know, there's no telling when that emergency declaration gets lifted. So we want to get started again, because we know a lot of people are eager to be heard.
Okay, good. I'm set with everything else. Thanks.
And Sally, I'll just note the current case count in Danvers is 643. And what I said in terms of the percent remains accurate. Is 3/4 of those cases are stemming from our long-term care facilities.
Thanks, Steve. Ted Blake?
I don't have any questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Ted. Sally Kearns?
Thank you. Sally Calhoun covered my questions around the COVID response here. I just do want to give a shout out to the nurses who, it sounds extraordinary. I was asked today, actually, by someone, will the school nurses be involved in contact tracing? And I said, gee, I don't know. So I guess we'll have to wait to see what the state tells us. I know that the state's hired like 1,000 contact tracers. So maybe the local people will be working alongside, you hope, right? With
No, so our school nurses have been working alongside our health department for the better part of a month and a half now. So
Right,
they've been there with us.
right. Oh, doing the contact tracing.
Yes, supporting
Wonderful.
Duke and Mark in that, which is the only way we've been able to. We had 2 people doing that before I think the 5 nurses joined forces with us. So it's been a heaven sent.
That's awesome. Great, thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Michael Daly.
I believe there's testing being offered now at the CVS on Newbury Street, which is Route 1. So I don't know if, I imagine you have to call or get an appointment if you want to get tested. I think you can have it done whether you have symptoms or you don't have symptoms.
That may be accurate. I'm not 100% clear on whether you need to have a doctor refer you or not at this point. But yes, I know we do have local testing sites that have been stood up in the last couple of weeks.
Other than that, I have no questions.
Thanks, Mike. Paul Pollock.
I'm all set. I have no questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Gina.
My questions are answered. Thank you.
Thank you. Jen, if you could unmute us for the vote. I have a motion from Ted Blake, seconded by Mike Landers, to move the Land Use and Community Services budget. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Steve?
Up next, recreation budget. Again, there's some moving pieces between what is part-time and versus temporary, but overall, the salary and wages are essentially flat here. They're up 1.7%. There's a considerable increase in playground equipment repairs, and I want to note that's a combination of parts to make repairs to our playground structures, but also it's to purchase wood chips for the surfaces in our playgrounds. And this has been a couple of years we've been trying to figure out the best way to do this. So we, as you all know, we have more than 20 neighborhood playgrounds in Danvers. We don't have 2 or 3 super sites. We have playgrounds. The vast majority of those playgrounds, outside of a couple, still have the old wood chip base. We have a couple of rubber surface playgrounds in town. But as you know, that those get very compacted over time. And we had been dealing with this in the warrant, where we would have a considerable purchase for wood chips one year and then it would drop off. And we're trying to figure out what the right number is. There are wood chips that have to be replaced every year. So we'd like to build that. We're trying to build that into the budget so that we're not seeing the roller coaster on the free cash. So we're the reason it's up 180% is that we're putting in some funds to do wood chips to keep the playground safe. There are compaction standards that have to be met in our playgrounds. I think if we could start over, if money were no object, we'd have a rubber membrane in every one of our playgrounds. But for better or worse, we're wedded to these chips, and we have to make sure that we're fluffing them up and replacing them regularly so that we have a safe playing surface. So that's what really sticks out in this budget, is that's a combination of parts for playgrounds and also wood chips to repair some surfaces.
Thanks, Steve. Gina?
Are there any playground replacements in the warrant articles this year?
So there was a request to replace the playground on Cabot by the high school, which part of that, one of the slides is currently boarded up. We've had that's an older playground. What survived the warrant process this year was funding to replace most of the pieces there. But the 2 components for these playgrounds are often the vertical steel posts that are anchored in concrete footings beneath the ground, and then the apparatus that are attached to them. So what's in the warrant that we'll look at next week is funding to replace most of the components of that playground, but leave the steel posts because they're still in good working order.
Okay.
We really do try to do a playground a year, and it's hard to keep up with that.
Well, that leads to my second question. Has the selectmen or anyone considered closing any of the smaller parks that are maybe close to another one?
So that's a discussion that's a question I've posed to David Mountain and the Recreation Committee. I believe they discussed it briefly a year or 2 ago, but the alternative to our current model would be to go the route of identifying 8 to 10 playgrounds and focusing on building those up. So, for those with kids, if you go to Wenham to Patton Park, you think of a structure like that, or even down, we have several that like Plains Park and Endicott, which are already larger playgrounds, obviously the school playgrounds. We have a lot of smaller playgrounds in neighborhoods, and I think removing those would probably be very unpopular, but it could make fiscal sense to focus our resources on a smaller number of larger play spaces.
Right, I'm thinking of, the Smith School will be getting a new playground, correct?
Correct.
I'm thinking the Thorpe School playground is far too small for that size school, and the high school playground is quite close. It just seems at some point it would make sense to maybe eliminate the high school playground and put in a bigger Thorpe playground, but I know the PAC would probably have to raise some money too. So just something to think about to reduce the amount of wood chips and maintenance you would have to do in the long term. That's all.
I will definitely pass the comments on to David Mountain. And I think right up there with dogs on leashes, moving playgrounds around is probably one of the most polarizing issues in a community. But he'll be happy to know people are talking about playgrounds. So I'll gladly pass the comments on.
Right, maybe there could be a special meeting. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Gina. Paul?
Yes, a couple of questions, Steve. General office supplies and forms printing are both up substantially. Could you explain that, please?
Probably not. But being honest, we can get an answer on that. I think one of the things, this is not an answer to the question, but I'll note I'll let Rodney, I think Rodney wants to speak, but the recreation budget had been part of the planning and human services budget years ago, and we broke it out as a standalone budget because we wanted to be able to better identify those costs. We actually moved some of our Endicott expenses out of DPW and into this budget a couple years ago. So there's an element of still figuring out what the right amount of some of these line items are. But I don't know, Ronnie, did you want to, you may have a more specific.
Yeah, I believe on the forms printing that was related to our recreational brochure going out twice instead of once. There's a little bit of increased cost there.
When you say twice instead of once, what was the justification for the twice versus the once?
I would defer to Dave Mountain by text, but I believe they get a good bang for their buck by getting that brochure into the hands of residents as far as participation in the programs. They felt that by going out twice a year, they'd capture more people.
Well, they have seasonal programs. So
Yes.
the summer program actually just went out, even though it's an open question whether we're going to be offering much in way of summer programming this year. That program was ready to go and paid for by the time COVID happened. So we did put out the summer program with a letter explaining that everything is very fluid right now. But there will be another program with different material going out later in the year.
I got you, sure.
Yeah.
The other question I had was, what's the status on the Endicott Park barn? I thought I heard you say at one point, I'm not sure, Steve, that it was on pause. And maybe you can clear that up.
So we discussed that at the Selectmen a few meetings ago, and we've actually engaged with DHCD to find out whether we may be able to try to reprogram those funds. There's no appetite at this point to move that project forward. I think, thinking about, some of the projects we talked about with Essex Tech last night, for example, the cottage project that they're taking on. So we had a $1 million grant from the state to do that project properly would have required an additional $2.2 million in debt service. It's a project that I think has a lot of merits, but as we're looking at, obviously the budget we're starting and thinking about trying to invest in a facility that is going to require large gatherings to support itself, the timing just felt wrong. So what we have is a really great conceptual design plan that could be put into play at some point. But the selectmen unanimously decided not to advance that project to the town meeting because it didn't seem prudent to be taking on several $1 million in discretionary debt at a time, when we're cutting our spending projections in half and preparing for social distancing for the foreseeable future. So I actually have a call set up for early June with DHCD. I've explained all this to one of the undersecretaries there. They completely understand that this is a good project. They get caught up in terrible timing. So we're looking at some options and opportunities to try to reprogram those dollars. I think the top project on the list, we have design almost complete for the first phase of the rail trail expansion, and what's available from the previous grant would fully fund the first phase of that project, bringing the trail essentially from the Hobart Street parking lot out to I was getting it wrong. I believe not the Greenleaf open space, but it would tie in more than 500 homes, 2 schools, and connect to some open space, which would be a really nice.
While you're on that topic, well, I want to go back to the barn in a second, but you just the rail trail. Now, when you say you're going to move it out from the Hobart parking lot, are you talking up to around the College Pond area?
College Pond, thank you. Yeah, not Greenleaf.
Right.
So the rail trail committee did the rail trail did a strategic plan a couple years ago, and creating the western expansion of the trail from the downtown out to the Middleton line emerged as a really important project from their perspective. Town meeting has supported some funds to explore that, and we're nearly done with the design for the first phase of that. So in terms of shovel readiness, as we're thinking about, there's no guarantee that the funds will be available, but that's the conversation that we've started to have with the HCD.
Now, when they talk about the College Pond area, would they be talking about working around the actual pond, similar to what a swamp walk would be out in the, out beyond the Agway in that area, out that way? Or are they just going to go up to the pond, or is that not a fair question to ask at this time?
I think the material may actually be on the website, but it would follow the town owns a utility right-of-way that goes from basically the Hobart Street parking lot all the way out to the Middleton town line. Crosses over Maple Street, and it would need to go, 1 in 95 present some challenges, but the bridge over Beaver Brook is the first obstacle in developing that. So for the most part, it would follow the utility corridor.
Okay, let me move you back to Endicott Park Barn.
Sure.
What you said is, for use of a better word, it's at least on pause at this point, correct? Then why would we want to allocate $10,800 for this proposed project this year? Or is that just something that you're holding, maybe not, depending on where we end up with overall budget problems or lack of thereof?
Yeah. So those are for repairs. Those are not. That's a building that needs a lot of work. This is one of the things we talked about in the fall, is that even if we didn't pursue the project to turn it into meeting space, the clapboards, the roof, the windows, the doors, there are needs on that building that have to be addressed over the next. I think what they identified is over the next 10, maybe 15 years, there's at least $500,000 in capital investment to keep that building standing. So this would be for, and I don't have the details at my fingertips, but probably window replacement or rotted wood that needs to be, swapped out.
Okay, that's a good explanation. Thank you very much. I'm all set, CR.
Thanks, Paul. Michael Daly.
It's a small item, but 55,805 uniforms. What are we talking there, like T-shirts and stuff, or uniforms for the recreation?
Yeah, probably collared. I would assume collared shirts for summer staff, year-round staff, and Endicott staff.
You still occasionally hire like high school or college kids part-time during the summertime?
In a normal year, we would have had them all under contract by now, but that's an open question right now, is what we're gonna do this summer. Yeah, we rely on high school and college kids to support our rec program.
Okay, I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Sally Kearns.
Well, I just would like to continue. You mentioned the summer rec programs, which I know are a lifeline for people. I'm happy to hear that there's discussion ongoing about how you would do it. I'm assuming they'll do something, right? I mean, they'll have small groups, many counselors, everything outside.
I don't want, yeah, I mean, those
Yeah,
conversations are ongoing and exhaustive right now. David Mountain and Aaron Henry have been, and Nick Campion have been in constant communication with MARPA and some of their cohorts. We're waiting for some guidance. Part of the governor's declaration about the reopening this week referenced some work that early childhood and public health are going to be doing to guide us. So we have we certainly hope, because we understand a lot of parents rely on those programs. What we're able to do and when we're able to do it will in part be driven by the data that's coming out of the state in terms of making some of these threshold determinations. But I can tell you that David and Nick and Aaron have every intention of trying to do something if they can this summer, and do it safely. I think that's the key. Is a lot of our programs simply don't lend themselves to the kinds of social distancing that we'd have to do. But we're trying to think outside the box to figure out a way to do that.
great, good to know. Thank you.
And if I could back up a little bit, David Mountain actually texted and corrected me that the Endicott Park barn expense, Paul, is for those are the supplies for the animal barn. So I was trying to repair windows, and David wanted to feed the animals, which is, I think, probably a better call. So.
Thanks, Steve. Ted Blake?
Where can you see the revenues that the rec department brings in?
Ronnie, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so this is, in addition to the operating budget, they have the rec revolving fund. As part of the warrant process next week, you'll reauthorize several funds, but as part of that process, we also provide update on all those revolving funds. So we'll have information for you by the end of this week, early next week, as part of the warrant process.
So,
Yeah.
So is the revolving fund, is that where the revenues go?
Yep, exactly. Revenues and certain expenses come out of the rec revolving fund, yeah.
So the $950,000 in tax support that recreation gets, they generate, north of $3 million in programming. So, I think off the top of my head, I think the child care revolving account that you guys see next week is roughly $690,000 in revenue. The rec revolving account is a considerable size. So, much of the tax supported goes toward free programming and the full-time staff that run the programming, but then each program generates enough revenue to support itself. So Fun Club being an example that I think most people are probably familiar with.
Yes, very.
I know.
That's it.
Thanks, Ted. Mike Landers?
I'm not in a position to be able to speak for everybody that was on the Endicott Park Barn committee. I know Sally was with me, but we did a lot of work on that. I think we were pretty proud of the project that was ultimately brought forward. And personally, I think it would have been a fantastic addition to the town. But I think I do speak for everybody on that committee when I say that we understand under the circumstances that there's no way that we can go before the town and seek that type of discretionary spending. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever under the circumstances. If we can get something out of that money, that's great. If we can, utilize it in some other way to help with economic development in the town, I think it would be wonderful. But I also, not to go back and beat a dead horse, but I agree entirely with the town manager about the difference in outlook when you look at the way other entities are trying to fund their projects under the circumstances and pushing forward with discretionary spending and building in a town that it just doesn't make any sense. So again, I think that was a tough choice to forego what amounted to probably 18 months of hard work by a pretty diligent group, but it had to be done. Otherwise, I'm good on this one. Thanks.
Mike, Sally Calhoun.
Thank you. Again, one missing the narrative that we've had in the past. A lot of times we'll talk about different department budgets and whether or not in the salary and wage items there's any change in number of employees in this coming for fiscal 21. Steve, is there any change that you anticipate?
Not in the recreation department, no.
Okay, thank you. That's the only question I had.
Thanks, Sally. The next page in our budget hymnals is the library. That was covered.
To vote
last night.
that budget, CR, do we need to
Oh, I'm
vote?
sorry. Yes, thank you. I'm sorry. And unmute everyone, and I have a motion from Gina McCusker, seconded by Ted Blake, to move that budget. All in favor, please?
Aye?
Aye.
Opposed? So, Steve, are we going to move on to debt service next?
We are going to move on to debt service, and I'll have Rodney unmute himself, and he can give you guys a rundown on the debt budget.
Sure. So in the debt budget, as you'll see, we actually see a drop overall of 3.72%. That's driven by a couple of factors. The Smith School bond offering was successful based in large part to, at the time, good market conditions, as well as the town's AAA rating. So that helped us there. We also have some debt falling off. So if you look at the sheet that was in your packet, we had some December 2001 authorizations that have fallen off for some land acquisition, as well as for some projects. Smith School HVAC fell off as well. It was $55,000 last year. So the net effect is a significant drop. The other item that dropped significantly was interest on temporary loans. So bonding some of the items such as the Smith School design funds, permanently financing that led to a drop in our interest on temporary loans, as well as the cost of bonds. We dropped that as well. So overall, 3.72%, a $256,000 reduction year over year.
And I'll add one note to what Mr. Conley just said, is that when we talk about the warrant next week, we'll also be talking about the debt stabilization fund, which we use to offset peak debt, in particular recently with the Smith School. So one of the other things that we had to do, we had planned to drop down the amount coming out of that account this year. But as part of the rebalancing act of the budget, we had to level fund the amount coming out. We're still proposing to make a contribution into that stabilization fund. But the net effect of that is going to put a little more pressure on the out years in terms of being able to generate enough into the account to shave the peak as we had planned to do over the 6 or 7 year window where the debt was going to be the highest. So the 6.64 million is the gross debt number. That's going to be offset by $2.3 million coming out of the debt stabilization fund.
Thanks, Steve. Sally Calhoun?
Thank you. Can you update us on the status of the Smith School construction?
I can actually. So construction, a number of more urban settings paused construction in the early stages of the pandemic. We did not. We worked very closely with the construction manager and the owner's project manager to make sure that they had stringent safety protocols in place. With the governor's announcement this week of construction reopening, we were pleased to see that very little had to change on site to comply with the guidance that had been issued. So, it's been a very safe site. We have been very lucky so far. We haven't seen any disruption really in either material supply chains getting to the site. The work has progressed rapidly. If you've been by the site, a lot of the structural steel is now in place. So it's still on track. And I'm hesitant to say that out loud, but we've been very fortunate so far. So it's on budget and on track still for the fall of 21 opening of the new school.
So focusing on that bond, on that debt that's issued, the $18,015,000, is that the full amount, or is there more that will be issued?
That's the first of several issuances. So we oftentimes, when you do a project of this size, you'll issue bond anticipation notes to get the work started, and then you will issue the long-term debt as you move forward. We made the decision because of the historically low rates last year to permanently finance the first portion of that project rather than doing the temporary financing, which saved us on the cost to do the temporary financing, but more importantly, locked in what we think are going to be very competitive rates. So we're about 20, David just confirmed for me, we're 20% through the construction of the school. Still on track for our opening, but there will be at least one more round of debt issued, potentially two, but certainly one more coming.
Are there any bond anticipation notes listed here on this page 32?
So the cost of bonds and the interest of temporary loans at the bottom is where we would cover our short-term financing. Ronnie, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I believe the only ban we have outstanding right now is related to the Highland Roof project. That's a $1.6 million ban we have outstanding.
And when do you think that one will go to bond?
I think the goal would be this coming, not this coming August, but the following August. We'll probably roll the ban for one more year and then permanently finance as part of a larger issuance. Most likely that second piece of the Smith School as well.
I just was wondering, since we're down for fiscal 21 on the total debt service, if it would be wise to go forward with bonding that project now, but I don't know how the market's going. I don't really understand it that well, but it's too soon.
So and one of the things, there are a couple of in making those decisions about the debt load, we have a debt policy that says that we try to keep our gross, our debt below a certain % of our operating budget. So it's at 6.6 million on $100 and some odd million budget. We're at or above the 6% range, which is close to the upper end of where we want to be. And so I think we need some of that relief so that we can pull back on some of the use of our debt stabilization fund. One of the priorities that the selectmen identified back in the fall as an objective that they wanted to see advanced this year and beyond is really focusing on a feasibility study for our consolidated public works yard. So we don't have there will be more school projects. I want to pop that bubble now. We talk about Smith being the last of the elementary schools, but it's really the last in this cycle of school renovations. We may not have to build a new school next time, but there will always be a school renovation on the horizon. But the public works yard is a large project that's been talked about for probably the better part of 10 or 15 years. So we're moving into the water and sewer space and Canal Street. We've always described that as sort of a medium-term solution. But we have public works spread in 4 or 5 different sites right now, and the board would like us to look at what sort of options we have long-term for getting them into one space. And so if and when that comes to fruition, it'll be good to have some debt capacity available for that.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Sally. Mike Landers?
Two pieces of the debt service, which go back to my days as a selectman. Choke Farm and the library construction are both coming off this year. So my days are numbered, I guess, in terms of the accomplishments that I had 20 years ago. But the debt service is fine.
Thanks, Mike. Ted Blake?
I guess just to go back to the Smith School conversation, it's not necessarily about the debt service, but one of the things that struck me last year when we talked about funding the project was how drastically construction costs have rose since we did the high school and since 2008. Is there a chance that we can save some money given the change in the economic environment in the last 6 months? Given that we still have 80% of the project left, how much of the work is still left to be bid, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Well, so one of the dilemmas there. We made the decision to enter into a GMP, so we have a construction manager at risk on this project. So when we went through that process a year and a half ago, and they bid on the project and won the project based on what their profit and overhead was going to be. They committed to deliver the project, below, at or below the GMP. So most of the major sub bids are out and accepted. We've locked in the GMP. The good news is, I think the bad news is we're not going to be able to leverage the economy for lower bids because we have a bottom line number that they have to deliver to. But I think the probability of us having it delivered for that GMP that they committed to is getting better and better by the month. So the GMP is locked. So the bidding has advanced to the point that number is now set.
Okay.
So, yeah.
That's it.
Thanks, Ted. Sally?
Yes.
Kearns?
All set, thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Michael Daly?
Can you describe a little bit about the land acquisition, what those expenses are for?
I believe these are related to several authorizations that town meeting provided over the past 20 years or so to pursue open space parcels that are identified in the open space plan. So I believe we have somewhere between $1.5 million left in bond authorization to pursue high priority open space parcels in the open space plan.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks. Paul?
CR, did you call me?
Yes, I did. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. I don't really have any questions on the debt, but just a little sidebar for those on the FinCom, and another question for Steve. But if you haven't been by the project, Smith School, you really should take a trip up there. Weekends would probably be better since they're not working on it. But the size of the building is what we expected it would be. And I'm not sure how much of the steel is up, but it looks like it's quite a bit. We haven't had a meeting in a long time, obviously, due to the COVID-19 situation. But when you drive by the project, the Smith School now is going to look like a maintenance building compared to the actual size of the school. It's quite impressive. I believe the Miles Winter helped us greatly with that project. And the only other thing I can ask Steve is, do you have any idea when we will meet again as a committee? And hopefully it won't be on this type of situation. We could get together again, maybe.
Well, the pandemic deprived us of a site walk that we had been planning.
I remember that, yeah.
And the groundbreaking ceremony where the little steel beam, you always have one steel beam painted white. It gets put in place at a ceremony. That piece is now in place, sadly. So if you drive by, you'll see one little white beam up on the structure, and that's the one that we were going to have our event on. Timing wise, because the committee last met right before site work and steel went up, so there's not really timing wise. It wasn't a bad time for the committee to take a pause because it's a lot of heavy construction. But we're probably another month or two out before we need to bring everybody back together. So timing wise, we're not in a bad spot. There's a lot of work going on. It's dirty work. It's important work, but when we need to start making decisions again, we'll be in the summer.
Okay. I was wondering what that white beam was for. Thank you for telling me. Okay, that's it. All set, CR.
Thanks, Paul. Gina?
No questions, thank you.
Thanks, Gina. Jen, if you could open up the call to everyone. And there is a motion by Paul Pollack, seconded by Ted Blake to move debt service budget. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Steve?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next up is the benefits and insurance budget. And this is really one where the narrative would have been helpful, because what you can't see with this document is the breakout of our insurance costs by funding area. So in your budget books that you'll get probably within the next week or so, you'll be able to see what the allocation is across water, sewer, electric, and general fund. And so the line item that I'd want to speak to here is the employee insurance line. The year-over-year decrease there is about 4.5%. But the vast majority of that decrease is actually the things we were talking about earlier, which is employees who had been carried for a number of years in the general fund that had belonged in either electric, water, or sewer. The actual year-over-year decrease in this account is about 0.46%. So when the budget books are issued, you'll be able to see that. So the costs went up considerably for some of the utilities because they hadn't been charged for their employees before. The savings here, again, is two things. There's about a 0.5% savings associated with the healthcare plan redesign that we completed last fall. And the other 4% of the decrease is simply reallocating costs to where they belong. And so for those, we've talked about this quite a bit at the selectmen meetings, but I can give the FinCom just a brief overview of sort of the process. We had been with Tufts since I think 2011. We were one of the original communities that joined MIA, which is the Massachusetts Interlocal Insurance Association. Back 30 years ago when it was created, Danvers was one of the founding communities. We left them in 2011 in part because we needed a solution for a small group of retirees that we had who were not on Medicare because they had never paid in. And the process to move those folks onto Medicare was so complicated that we simply started shopping for new carriers. We ended up with Tufts. The rates in recent years with Tufts had been averaging around, I think, just under 5%, might be 6%. I don't have my notes. But in a budget like ours, that was not a sustainable number. So about a year and a half ago, we started working with the IAC, looking at different plan design options. And where we ended up last fall was we had moved back to Maya, in part because they recognized enough of their municipal partners were struggling with this small group of retirees that they essentially hired the staff that they needed to manage those groups on behalf of their members. So they had a custom fit solution for us for what we kind of call the pre-86ers. These are folks who had been hired before 1986 and for one reason or other didn't qualify for Medicare. So we have Maya has created a crosswalk for us to move those folks onto Medicare, which is actually good for them and for the town. It's a much less costly program, and most of the benefits are the same. Providers are the same. But when we looked at our plan, we were in a traditional copay plan. High premiums, low cost in terms of out of pocket for some of the copays, but the premium increases year over year were proving unsustainable. And we ended up working with this group to develop a plan where we have essentially two options now for employees. There is a benchmark plan, which is modeled off of the most popular plan offered through the Group Insurance Commission, the GIC. And that's essentially it's a copay plan with a modest embedded deductible in it, $500 for an individual, $1,000 for a family. Alongside that, the town is offering a optional high deductible plan with a $2,000 individual deductible, $4,000 family deductible. And so employees have the option of choosing between the benchmark plan, which functions more like our traditional plan, versus a high deductible plan. Alongside that, we offered this year a healthcare an opt-out incentive. So for those employees who have a spouse with access to health benefits, the town is offering an incentive for town employees to join their spouse's plan. The enrollment period just ended, so we haven't had a chance to look at the final numbers yet. But we were surprised there was quite a bit of interest in both a high deductible plan that was offered and the opt-out incentive. So we're probably a year or two from understanding sort of where the dust will settle on the redesign. But we went from averaging a 5 or 6% increase to a 2.5% decrease in terms of premiums for both employees and the town. That of course is offset by the introduction of the deductibles, but it did a couple of things. It put us on a different trajectory. So it reset the trend line we're optimistic that we'll experience I'm going to put an asterisk next to what I'm about to say. We're optimistic that it's going to put us on a more sustainable trend line. But I think it's an open question what impact COVID is going to have on health insurance from East Coast to West Coast a year from now. But so I think that remains, I guess, a question that we're all going to find the answer to moving forward. But in the short term, it was a long process, a lot of education. We hit some bumps, but it culminated last fall with a presentation to the Board of Selectmen, and they authorized us to implement these plans. And so the outcome of that process is reflected here in the budget. So again, year over year, it would be about a 0.5% decrease instead of a 4 or 5% increase. But that number is skewed a little bit by the fact that we were also reallocating some costs to the more appropriate funding sources. So I'd be happy to take any questions, and I want to acknowledge, although she's behind the curtain managing the mute unmute right now, Jen Breaker has really run point on this for us. She has vast knowledge in this arena, has had individual conversations with literally hundreds of our employees to help them figure out how to navigate the new plans, and her staff have been doing a tremendous job. So I want to acknowledge that. She's still on mute. She's not going to come on and say hello, but I wanted to make that statement. So I think we'd be happy to take any questions you have about this budget.
Thanks, Steve. We'll start with Gina.
Why is the Medicare FICA insurance up 10%? I'm sorry if you already covered it.
I didn't cover it, and I'm going to defer either Jen or Rodney to tackle that one.
The Medicare is going up because we are moving the pre-86ers, as Steve mentioned, as we refer to them, to Medicare, and there are some costs with moving them, but it's offset by the reduction we have in carrying them on our active health insurance plans.
Okay, so those are current employees, not retirees?
No, they are retirees. There's a group of retirees that was hired at a time where they didn't pay into Medicare. So
right. They're
not eligible for Medicare, so they've always stayed on what we call an active plan instead of going on a retiree plan because they were not eligible. But we are essentially putting them into an eligible plan, but there are some associated costs with that.
Okay, so even though we have a retirement budget, all of the retirees' benefits are in this department, is that correct?
Their health insurance benefits, correct.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. That's all I have.
Thanks, Gina. Paul Pollock.
I'm all set, CR. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Michael Daly.
I have no questions, but I have a request. I wish you would, this particular page and others similar to it, I wish you could take the font and kick it up a notch because it is very, 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 very hard to read. That's all. Thank you.
Mike, I will say that was on our list of things to do this year, and I regret to say that COVID sort of popped that plan. But you're not the first person to ask that, and we are going to figure out year's budget how to make those numbers a little bigger.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Sally Kearns.
How many pre-86ers are there? How many people went into a plan where their deductible went up?
I think those are two different questions.
Are they?
Do you want to take that, Jen?
So the pre-86ers went on Medicare, not under the two active plans that Steve described. So the Medicare is a very rich plan. The Medicare supplement that the town provides is a great supplement, very rich, and it has a nice cost for it. It's better than the retirees going out on their own and getting a supplement plan because it's a group plan instead of an individual plan. So all of those individuals are on Medicare plans, not one of the two active plans.
And how many of the 86 people, that category, how many in that category?
It's around 34. I don't have that number right in front of me now, but it's right around 34.
Okay, and then there was also a change that put more people into a plan with a higher deductible.
So yeah, the both of the plans being offered have introduced deductibles, which is something that the town healthcare plans didn't have prior to this. And I think we did a number of presentations with staff to compare there's a correlation between your premium and your out-of-pocket expense, whether that out-of-pocket expense is a deductible that stops or various copays for various things. So the impact at the individual level is going to vary from person to person, but there is now a deductible concept that is embedded in both of the plans. So if you're on the benchmark plan, there's a $500 deductible for an individual, and as well as some copays that would exist after that. If you're an individual who chooses the high deductible plan, you have a $2,000 deductible.
That's a whopper.
Well, that was an optional. So that was the optional plan, and the town is helping. So one of the advantages of the high deductible plan is that the federal minimum for having a health savings account, which is much different from a flex spending account, is that if your deductible is higher than, I believe, $1,800, so we set ours at $2,000, you can set up an HSA, and the town is going to help fund that for the first couple of years of the plan. The advantage of the HSA is that it does not lapse like an FSA. You don't have to. It's not use it or lose it, so it can grow with you. If you're redirecting premium savings into it, it can be something that you can use even on into retirement. But it's a change. I mean, I think what you're saying is right. We had a plan that I think most of the world is moving or has moved into the direction of deductibles, and we held out for a long time. But I think we had $860,000 of our budget increase last year was to cover the health plan.
Right. It's hard. It's a very hard.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Ted Blake?
Hi, Steve. I guess the one question I had, I know you sort of did with COVID, it's hard to say, but do you have any expectation on what the year-over-year increase might look like with this plan?
So,
for maybe what some other towns that have been in the plan have experienced. Are we looking at 6%? Is this like a one-time reset of that, and then next year it'll start to go up 6% again, or?
I mean, I'll give you the honest answer, which is I have no idea. And then I'll give you the answer that has been provided to us by the actuaries who do this work, which is that the plans that we're putting in place do have lower trend lines than the one we're departing. So the copay plan, as I said, I think the last 3 fiscal years we were averaging 6% renewal. The carrier, of course, starts wanting more than that, and we sort of fight our way to a 6%. In one of the things we got with Maya, so year one, it's a minus 2.47%. Year two is going to be either our actual renewal or the average renewal for their trust, which was close to a 0 last year. And then beyond that, it's your experience is going to determine your premium. And the thought here is that by removing those 34 retirees from our active plans, who generally are the most expensive members, and by introducing the deductible concept, both of those things should put us on a different trend line. My fear, of course, is that whatever is going to happen from COVID we're not going to get a clean comparison year to year, because wherever we would have been next year based on a normal year, it's going to be awfully hard to make that year-over-year comparison.
Okay. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted. Mike Landers?
No, I'm all set. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. Sally Calhoun?
Thank you. So this $81,000 item for the Medicare switchover, is that a one-time expense, or will that carry on in the future?
Jen just came off me. I'll let her answer that.
That will carry on, but will probably slightly reduce every year. It carries on as long as the same number of Medicare eligible retirees remain on our plan.
So it's not kind of a one-time expense. It goes on as long as they're on it, type of thing.
It will go on as long as the same number of Medicare eligible retirees, and it's set right now. There will never be more than we have in that group of pre-86ers. So that number will decline.
Right. Got it. And then the other question, I think you've really already answered, which was, I know that there, in the past, there were times when the town would pay or reimburse the employees for co-pays. And I was wondering if this new plan does that. And you kind of talked about how the town's going to participate possibly in setting up the HSAs for the first year or something.
Yeah. So the way that we designed the high deductible plan is that we'll cover 50% of the HSA in year one, a smaller portion in year two, and what we're hoping is that if enough savings are generated here, that we'll be able to create some sort of modest matching program with employees, because I think there's a real advantage to getting participants in these plans to invest in their HSA. Because once you have a balance in there, it can be invested in earning income. It goes in tax free. It's not taxed when it comes out, so there's a benefit there. And importantly, and we've talked a lot about, if your premium goes down a little bit, at a minimum, you should be redirecting those savings into your HSA, so that if you do have an event, 6 months from now, 2 years from now, you'll have that HSA in place to help with that. So it's a 2-year commitment, and beyond that, if we're able to, if the savings are real, and we're able to budgetarily, the idea is that we would like to try to figure out a way to do a modest match to get people to put money aside for that.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Thanks, Sally. Jen, if you could unmute everyone for the vote on the benefit budget. We have a motion by Ted Blake, seconded by Gina McCusker, to move the budget. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
Next up is the retirement budget. Rodney, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So retirement budget is going up 7.75%. That's pretty much in line with what we expect, which is the 8% increase over the next several years based on our actuarial study. That's in the process of being updated over the next month or so. In fact, I think the board will be voting on an updated schedule this coming Wednesday. We had great calendar year results in 2019. We were up 17.33%, which made up somewhat for a bad 2018. And then the good 2019 has been wiped out so far by a bad 2020 calendar year. So overall, we'll see what the next actuarial valuation study says a couple of years from now, when we'll see the full impact of COVID. But for right now, we had a good end of 2019. I think that's about it. If there's any specific questions on the investments.
I'll point out a couple things just to add to what Rodney said. We actually had a call this morning with our actuary. So we're about 60% funded right now, which is good, because we've changed some assumptions in our system in the last couple of years. We reduced our rate of return, which is important, and we've still been able to maintain a funded ratio of 60%. You'll note the electric division. There's a large minus number there. That's driven by the fact that the municipal light board authorized a payment of north of $4 million last year to fully fund their unfunded liability. So aside from small liabilities that may occur, as is happening this year when market conditions change, the electric department is effectively fully funded now, a full 15 years before the town will be. So there were 2 payments made by the light board to do that. The rating agencies, the auditors, praised that decision. We put the reserves to use to buy down future liability. That's going to have a direct impact on future rates. And we are, as Rodney said, our funding schedule is going to be requiring 8% increases to maintain our 2035 fully funded ratio, or fully funded date for a number of years now. And this is the expense driver I mentioned at the beginning of the night yesterday. Between this and Essex Tech, you're looking at 50% of the proposed spending next year for FY21. So there's a $500,000 increase here, along with the tech. It comprises half of the proposed budget.
Thanks, Steve. Sally? Calhoun?
So do we know yet what the contribution is gonna be, what the dollar amount is? Is it gonna be the 6,648,000?
Nope,
Yes, that's correct. Yep.
Which is a $515,000 increase. Okay, I'm just trying to wander to the numbers you were talking about, and I think I just clicked. Okay, thank you. I've got no questions.
Thanks, Sally. Mike Landers?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Ted?
So, the one, I think Steve, you mentioned the 2035 goal. So part of the reason why this is growing at a fairly steady clip is we're basically doing catch-up contributions to get to a fully funded state by 2035. Is that?
Yes, yeah. And so the statutorily, I mean, we would probably put in more than 8% if it were an uncapped contribution.
Right.
But statutorily, we're not required to put in. So if you look at our funding schedule, it shows for the next 4 or 5 years, 8%, 8%, 8%, and then it'll drop down to 6, and then eventually down to closer to 4. But we're still a half a decade away from being there.
Okay. And when you say 8%, 8% of what?
8% increases, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, year-over-year increases.
Okay. But you expect it to drop to 4% year over year sometime in the next five years or so?
I'm going to have a lot more gray hairs in my beard when we're at
okay.
We're probably closer to 10 years away from being at the 4% clip. We're going to be at 8 for probably half a decade, and then it'll work its way down to 3.9 eventually.
And how much of this in the pension liability is driven by an increase in life expectancies?
I am not an actuary.
Yeah.
Rodney, do you want to? I mean, we did have a call this morning. We talked a little bit about the I think PIRAC just updated all of its mortality tables, so that is inching up, and the reason it's inching up is because people are living longer. So, you know, we're inheriting new liability because we're finding that the mortality rates were not calibrated correctly. So, I think they used the term positive attrition in their trade, which is, of course, a euphemism for what Ben didn't want to say in the benefits budget.
Okay. I think that's it for me.
Thanks, Ted. Sally Kearns?
No, I'm fine, thank you. If Ted Blake didn't have further questions, neither do I.
Thanks, Sally. Mike Daly?
No questions.
Thanks, Mike. Paul Pollock?
This one's beyond my pay raise, so I'll move on. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And Gina?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer, and I have a motion from Mike Landers, seconded by Sally Kearns, to move the budget. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Thank you.
So turning to page 35, this is the capital outlay. We've had a couple of questions so far tonight on that. I trust David Lane is still watching from home and ready to answer questions, support me here. But I'll note, so some of these items, when we talk about this, we're really focusing on that $720,000 number. The school bus lease will be part of the warrant review next week. The water and sewer vehicles were voted as part of their operating budgets. So we have the actual vehicles broken out here. And then electric, of course, there's no vote required on that. That's a vote that town meeting will ultimately take, but those expenses are captured in the electric budget. So we can start at the top. I mean, I think I mentioned these meetings are blurring together in my head now because I'm on so many of these calls, but we may have discussed last night that the The $720,000 to support capital outlay, that comes from free cash. It's a higher number than what was in last year's budget, which was $596,000. A year prior to that, we were at $998,000. So 720 is a little bit below, but not far from our historic average. This is a revised. I mean, it is always a revised request. DPW, Recreation, Endicott, Code, the schools, the like. The list of vehicles that are due to be replaced is always longer than what we can ultimately do. So this list represents a scaled back version of what the original request was in December and January. Generally speaking, we try to do one large piece of equipment a year. This year, that's in the street division. It's one of our big plows with a sander on the back. You'll see forestry. There's a stump grinder. There's a pickup truck there. A column lift to support some of the that would be something in the equipment division that would allow them to service larger vehicles and not have to send those out to do. I believe Mike asked about the police vehicles. So, our plan calls for 5 a year. We've had to do 4 a year in recent years. This is one of those years. That 215 represents not only the car itself, but also, the outfitting that a car with the technology and the equipment that it needs. So it's not just the SUV. It's also the bells and whistles inside that the officers need to do their job. So I think rather than kind of working my way down the list, I'd be happy to take questions on this. Again, this is presented as part of the budget. It's funded through free cash, and this is one of those areas going into this budget year before the Essex Tech assessment or the special ed costs or COVID. This was an area where we wanted to try to work some of these capital expenses into the tax levy, where our view is they more appropriately belong. The argument for you doing free cash supported capital is that if you ever had a year where you had to spend $0, you could flip a switch and do that. In reality, it doesn't work that way. To think that there's every year where we would have $0 in capital needs, we would be kicking multiple cans down the road. And a lot of these vehicles are due to be replaced because they're at the end of their useful life, and so you end up incurring overtime costs and maintenance costs and emergency repair costs and the like. So again, I think I'll stop there, and we'd be happy to take any questions about the items on this list. And I know David is ready to help us if I can't answer them.
Thank you. Gina.
So all of these items on the tax supported list are absolute needs, and none of them can be delayed if we have a cash shortage. Is that true? I think that's what you were trying to say.
Yeah, no, I mean, some of them, some of them could be delayed, and there are years where by the end of the fiscal year we may not have actually purchased a vehicle. We don't just go to the lot and pick out the truck we want. A lot of these are custom orders. We're using state contracts, and we have to get customized equipment on these trucks. So it's a process when we replace some of these pieces. And I think to answer the question, we could defer some of these. Some of these though, and I'd need David to speak to some of the details. If we have a truck that's been out of service for 4 months, on average a year for the past 2 years, and had a transmission replaced to the tune of $5,000 or $6,000, he would say would be a penny wise and a pound foolish to not replace that vehicle because it's just creating more work for the equipment division. Some of the other things.
Sorry to interrupt, but same with the truck with the plow and the sander. If we have another mild winter, do we really need that? But I suppose if we have a tough winter, then we'd be short.
Yeah.
And you have to go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah, I was gonna say the longstanding practice when I got here, and I didn't initiate this, but I applaud it, is that the town of Danvers has always been very aggressive with its capital replacement. We don't have to. A lot of towns bond and issue debt for these types of purchases, and we've always paid cash for them. So we never pay interest on these. We try to keep up. I think it's helpful that we're not chasing bad vehicles. But I think the point I think you're driving toward is, in a year like this, do we eliminate this? And I think my my response to that would be, this is a year where no matter what the budget looks like on July 1st, a lot of the expenses are going to be, we're going to be very strategic in making decisions about both when we hire positions, when we purchase equipment. So we could authorize this and end up, quite honestly, probably sitting on 3/4 of it for the better part of the year to see where things fall. Because if we're in a cash crunch in the fall, one easy thing to do is de-appropriate some of these, and this money goes right back to free cash again.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Gina. Paul?
Yes, thank you. So so basically the tax supported items that we're looking at here, that will come out of free cash. Is that correct, Steve?
Yeah, the all 720, actually everything. So the $720,000, as well as the $30,000 for the bus payment, but that bus payment will be covered as part of the warrant next week. But yes, the first table there is the
Right.
tax supported. So that, but tax supported, it's all coming from free cash.
Yes, and we prefer not to take issue bonds for any of this type of equipment. This is
Correct.
what our history is. Now the bottom part of the table it's rate supported, so that it's not the same issue per se. Is that correct?
Well, it is and it isn't. I think.
Well, are they restricted as to, let's say, item number one, $40,000? How are they? Do they have the same issues that you'd have in the top part of table one? So it was not coming out of free cash; it's coming out of rate support. They've got their budget, right?
Yeah, it's coming out of either these are coming out of rates. They could also come out of retained earnings, but these would come out of the rates.
Right.
But a similar as we talked about during the water budget, we're not sure yet what the full impact of COVID is going to have on our sales.
Yes.
We've been watching our water sales decline long before COVID because of some of the permit restrictions that we're under with the DEP. Because you get if the winters and the summers are mild, that affects your electricity and your water sales. So similarly, I mean, we have some concerns going into next year on the utility side, just as we do on the general fund side, because we don't know what the full impact of this crisis is going to be. So it's a similar story in that these are the pieces that made it to the top of the list in terms of replacement. There's no requirement to buy them on July 1st. So if these vehicles don't get replaced this year, the rates that are generated to purchase them end up flowing into next year's retained earnings account.
Okay.
Which is a little bit different from the free cash purchase, which it's already in free cash and it would just stay there.
All right, that's all I have, CR. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Mike Daly.
Yeah, these items, were they already included in the budgets that we've already voted on? Or are you just considering this as a separate budget now, this capital outlay? You used to have a line item with a capital outlay in each individual budget.
Yep. So the water and sewer vehicles, so the $50,000 for water and the $55,000 for sewer were already voted as part of their budgets. The vote that we're talking about now would be for the $720,000. And the change you're describing is one we made a couple of years ago where historically, you pick on Inspectional Services. That's a very small budget. And in a year where they have to replace one of their SUVs, suddenly there's a $40,000 spike in their operating budget that disappears the next year. We always spend about the same amount on capital. It just changes from department to department. So we wanted to isolate all those costs here and treat them as their own. So that's why you're not seeing them anymore in the operating on the general fund side.
Okay, so we're going to be voting on this as a separate budget. So I wanted to know.
Correct.
And I read somewhere, do we have 13 cruises?
Pat's going to answer that. I know we have 5 on the road at any given time. So give me a minute, Mike. I'll give you the answer to that.
Yeah, I read it somewhere. I forget where I read it. I was astounded. I didn't think we had that many, but if we do, fine.
Mike, do you have any other questions while we're waiting?
No, that's it.
Okay, Shelley Kearns.
No, we've had the conversation about essential and whether some of this can be put off, but it sounds to me like the way it's structured that if push really comes to shove in the fall, that you could, did you say deappropriate them?
Yeah, if we're
And
in,
what's that process?
same as the appropriation process, only in reverse. So we would have, correct, yeah. So I mean the timing may or may not. Assuming worst case scenario, we're planning a fall town meeting anyway for zoning, so we could put items on that town meeting to deal with any budget issues that we're going through. But if the situation's bad enough, I think it'll be well worth calling a town meeting mid-year to address whatever's happening.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally.
To answer Mike's question, we have 12 marked cruisers. So we replace somewhere between 33 and 45% of those a year, part because they're in constant use, 24/7.
Thank you. Mike, do you have a follow-up to that at all?
Me?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Mike Landis?
Mike Daly.
No, I'm all set.
Okay, thank you. I think we're on Ted.
No, nothing here.
Great, thanks, Ted. Mike Landers?
Makes perfect sense to do it the way that we're doing it, and to be very cautious on a lot of these in terms of proceeding and purchasing them, maybe perhaps later in the year.
Thanks, Mike. And Sally?
Thank you. This may be kind of a dumb question, but I was looking at the electric budget, which always mystifies me anyway. But I can see in the electric budget that Digger Derrick, 280,000 appears on page 40, but I don't see the other two items. Is there, maybe they just don't line up. Maybe I'm looking for things to line up and they won't. But is this that these are the things that survived the effort to scale budgets back?
So if you're talking about the capital plan for the electric department, and you'll see at the very bottom or toward the bottom of that, you'll see rolling stock.
Is this on page 40?
I'm on 41 now.
Oh. Okay, and that's where this stuff would appear?
Well, it's either going to be broken out in the area you're looking at on 40, or some of that could be rolled into the rolling stock piece.
Okay.
But I would note, I mean, I think that if you notice, mobile column shows up 4 times on this chart at $10,000. It's actually a $40,000 piece of equipment, but because it's going to be used to service vehicles from all of our divisions, it's a cost that gets shared across the divisions.
I was going to ask if they could just get one for everybody, but that makes a lot of sense. I can't wait to see a new truck, a plow, a sander that's 181,000. I hope it's blue.
It'll be big and white with an orange stripe on the side.
I don't have any other questions.
Thanks, Sally. And Jen, if you could unmute us for the vote on capital outlay. Motion from Ted Blake, seconded by Gina McCusker to move the capital outlay budget.
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing. Are we just voting to approve the 720,863?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. On to the electric division budget. Just a reminder that this is a budget that will actually be voted on next week during the warrant. And before I turn things over to Steve Bartha, I'd like to turn it over to Mike Landers for a moment. Mike?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to remove myself from this. I'm on the municipal electric light board, and although I don't think I'm probably would be involved with a conflict with this because I don't get paid by them or anything else. But just to be safe, I'm gonna remove myself and not involve myself at all with this budget. So I will be turning off, and I thank all of you, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Mike.
And Mr. Chairman, I probably won't spend a lot of time on this because we're planning to have David Lane on the call with us next week to talk through the capital projects. And he'll be able to get into much greater detail in this budget than I can. So quite honestly, I think we could probably stop it there if you wanted, and we can save since there's no vote required tonight for electric, we could address that when we have the benefit of having David Lane on the call with us.
That's absolutely fine. I'm happy to do that.
Great.
Okay. And if Jen could unmute us all, I'm happy to entertain a motion to adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Great. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Great work.